For a while, Nick just looked out the window. He saw so much cruelty and wasted potential. If the rich gave just a little to the people of the Dregs, they wouldn't need to pay with their blood. They could be healthier and contribute more to society. Of course, people who don't work don't deserve to own as much as people who do, but they deserve some dignity, at least enough to survive. As long as people can have a home, food, water, and a family, it's okay. If I can turn this dream into reality for this city, I can say with certainty that I would have somewhat redeemed myself. While Horio will never get to live his life, at least his death won't have been pointless. Maybe he would even have given his life if it meant improving the lives of so many others. "So you've been standing there a while," the rat said awkwardly. "Got anything to tell me?" Nick didn't look at the rat, only at the city outside. "I guess there's something I can do with my life," Nick said. Right now, Nick's emotions were complex. On one hand, he felt righteous indignation and a drive for retribution. On the other, the emptiness in his chest still made him feel like he wanted to die. It was a strange mix of motivation and lethargy. The only way to suppress the conflict was to focus on making something of his life. "I might have been a stupid idiot in the past, and I might still be one, but I might not always be one." "So you feel better?" the rat asked. Nick didn't immediately answer. "In a way, yes," Nick said. "I know what I want to do at least." "Okay, good, good," the rat said with a grin. "You don't want to kill yourself anymore." Nick sighed. "Wanting to kill myself isn't really important. The fact is that I can't. There's something I want to do, which means I can manage to survive. Whether I want to or not." "Great," the rat said. "Then my job here is done." The rat walked over to one of the windows. "If you need information about Specters, you can always call me," the rat said with a grin. "The price will be higher than the first time, but that shouldn't be a problem. After all, a Specter is worth more than just a couple of corpses, right?" Nick furrowed his brows and didn't answer. "See you soon, Nick," the rat said before leaving through the window. Nick kept facing the city. "Parasite," Nick thought with narrowed eyes. "You might have helped me see a way forward, but we both know you only want more corpses." Albert said Specters can't feel empathy, and this conversation proved him right. The parasite couldn't even understand the value of human life, how killing a child is different from killing a criminal adult. "You might appear nice and helpful, but in the end, you still convince countless people to let you kill them. Without you, many people would still be alive." Nick narrowed his eyes further. "For now I need you, but in the future things will change." Nick turned from the window and sat on his bed, but this time, he didn't just blankly stare at the wall. "This entire city is run by monsters, and if I want to significantly improve everyone's lives, I need to become as strong as them. A few donations won't be an issue, but giving everyone enough money to escape the blood tax will almost certainly put a target on my back. Blitz is earning a crazy amount from the blood tax. The 100 credits probably can't remotely compare to what 2 liters of blood are worth. I could use my wealth now to improve life in the Dregs, but I'd quickly become a target and get killed. The only chance is to become more powerful. If I can become a level 6 extractor, I'll probably be strong enough to save the people of the Dregs." "A hero, huh?" Nick thought, looking forward with furrowed brows. The fact that the current leaders of the city are called heroes is disgustingly ironic. He took a deep breath and sighed. "And I won't be any different, I guess. After all, what hero kills a kid?" Nick shook his head rapidly to get rid of the intruding thoughts that threatened to drag him back into lethargy. Instead, he stood up and looked at the weapons on the ground. "I need power," he thought as he slowly put on the braces. "For that, I need Zephyx. And to get Zephyx, I need enough power to acquire and defend it." At that point, Artem's smirking face shot through Nick's mind. "People like Artem will try to kill me and take my wealth, and they won't use it to improve anyone's life." Next, Nick grabbed one spear and put it on his back. "I haven't trained in a long while, and I've already noticed my physical condition deteriorating. I should get back to training." But at the thought of training, he already felt exhausted, and he quickly realized why. "Right, I haven't properly eaten in a long while." Nick no longer looked at food as an indulgence, but as fuel. He needed it to survive and to become stronger. "Let's get some food with lots of protein, and then I'll run around the Dregs to improve my stamina." Nick nodded once and stepped out of his room. Chapter 113, Training. For the rest of the day, Nick focused on training and planning his future. strength, money, status. Nick needed all of these if he ever wanted to repay a little of what he owed Horua. The more time passed, the more Nick realized how much of it he had to dedicate to whatever he wanted. Horua had eaten so much of Nick's time and focus that, without him, Nick felt like there was nothing else to do. For the first time in forever, Nick actually felt exhausted after working out. He had run around the outer city several times. The citizens weren't surprised by a Zephyx Extractor running around. There were quite a few level 1 Extractors in the outer city, and they also needed to keep fit. From time to time, Extractors jogged and ran throughout the city. Naturally, Nick sped up and slowed down constantly. Since he always put in the same effort, his speed kept changing as his ability activated and deactivated. And the best part was that Nick didn't even need to try to keep his ability a secret. If anyone saw him, it deactivated on its own. In a way, he was forced to keep it secret, since he couldn't show it to anyone even if he wanted. When he was exhausted from running, he grabbed his weapons and trained with them. Their heavy weight made it strenuous to move, but that was what Nick wanted. Training was supposed to be exhausting. In the evening, Nick even bought expensive food. Meat that didn't come from rats or insects. Apparently, there were indoor farms where small, fat, flightless birds called chickens were raised. According to the person in the expensive-looking shop, chicken meat was extremely rich in protein and almost had zero fat. Nick didn't care about the fat, but he cared a lot about the protein. So he bought 2 entire cooked chickens and ate them. After the first, Nick already felt full, but he forced the second down too. One had to remember that Nick had built an impressive body while living in the dregs on his own. If he didn't know how to build such a body, he wouldn't have one. 150 credits, Nick thought. 150 credits for one meal even if it was a lot. If I ate normally, it would still be 75 credits. That's almost a month of tax. Nick had never eaten a meal this expensive. But the taste was amazing, and the contents of the meat mattered. While eating it, he almost felt his body screaming in euphoria. Sadly, the euphoria was dampened by the black void in his chest. Nick had done a lot today and eaten amazing food, but the void barely seemed weaker than in the morning. The guilt, regret, worthlessness, self-hatred, and pointlessness were as present as ever. Nick knew very well that everything he did was just a distraction from his emotions. But it was the only thing he could do. There was no way for him to deal with them. He would need to be rid of the guilt, but he could only be rid of it by repaying Horua, which was impossible. There was no way to fix this, which meant he had to live with it. He wasn't courageous enough to kill himself. He wouldn't mind dying the next moment, but he wouldn't actively search for death. It was a kind of limbo. If I can make life in the dregs better, I might be able to live with myself, and if I die along the way, it's no loss. It's a win-win either way, Nick thought as he set his weapons aside. Eventually, it was time for bed. It was difficult. With nothing to distract him, his mind was constantly drawn to the things he had done. Luckily, the strong exhaustion of his battered body made him drift off relatively quickly. Nick slept over 10 hours, far more than normal. But it makes sense, he thought. I went through a lot yesterday and I trained more than I ever have. I never had the luxury of safety, which always stopped me from completely exhausting my body, and food was always an issue. Nick felt some weakness in his body, but not as much as he'd expected. He had trained a lot in his life and was very familiar with his body. This felt like ordinary muscle soreness. I've become quite a bit stronger since I last trained, Nick thought. The last time was before I joined Dark Dream. I've advanced several levels since then. As a late level 1 extractor, my body converts prefix into Zephyx that can't be harvested, which is then used as fuel for my movements. It wouldn't be strange if the Zephyx also healed my body, Nick thought as he moved his arm to test its strength. Including today, I still have 2 more days of rest. I should use them. Nick quickly left his bed, bought a heavy breakfast, and started running again. This time, he decided to wear his 4 cuffs while running. That made it many times harder, but he kept at it. Whenever he felt his strength failing, he told himself he wasn't doing this for himself but for Horua. Nick didn't allow himself to become complacent. He had to repay Horua. Chapter 114, Back to Work. Nick woke and looked at the clock. 5:35, he thought. The alarm rings in 10 minutes anyway. He left his bed, walked to the clock on the wall, and clicked a button on its side. He He had learned just yesterday from one of the clerks that the hotel clocks had an alarm function. This made things much easier. After deactivating the alarm, Nick grabbed his cuffs. But before putting them on, he looked at his wrists. He saw some faded cuts and furrowed his brows. A memory from 2 days ago shot through his mind. After running with the cuffs, he had come home, taken them off, and seen that they had cut into his skin. While the 4 cuffs were expensive weapons, they weren't designed to be worn for hours of running. Naturally, his bleeding wrists hurt, but he didn't view the pain as bad. In a way, it reaffirmed his conviction. Seeing how much he had pushed himself somewhat calmed his guilt. He was putting in so much effort he was even bleeding. Even if Horua could see him, he wouldn't say Nick wasn't trying his best. The next day the cuts had somewhat healed, but scabs remained. Nevertheless, Nick put on the cuffs again and trained the entire day. He bled again, but not as badly as the first day. And this morning the cuts were nearly gone. One would only notice them if one knew they were supposed to be there. Eventually, Nick put on the cuffs and left for work. He hadn't officially been to work for 3 days, but unofficially it had been about 5. So much had happened in the last 5 days. Nick killed Pater. Horua died. Nick started to feel horrible. Nick found a new goal. Nick trained. To Nick, it felt like he hadn't been at work for a month. He walked out of the hotel and into a nearby shop that sold food. In the last couple of days, Nick had found something else that tasted amazing. Apparently, these chickens also laid eggs, which were a great source of many things a human needed. But the eggs were expensive. One egg wasn't very big, yet it cost almost 10 credits. Nevertheless, Nick saw spending money like this as an investment. If eating the eggs were just a hobby, he'd feel like he was throwing money out the window. But this was for his future and his power. Nick needed to invest money into his power. Because of that, the high price didn't bother him much. And the price wasn't actually that high, considering what Nick made in a day. As the chief Zephyx Extractor, Nick made 10% of what Trevor, Jenny, and the Screaming Coffin produced. So even if he didn't work himself, he made at least 2,000 credits a day. 200 to 300 credits for food was barely 10% of that. After shoving 5 eggs down, Nick went to Dark Dream. As he entered, he slightly furrowed his brows. His ability had deactivated, but he couldn't see anyone. The spy is back, Nick thought. Sadly, it's not time yet to confront Artem. Nick walked forward and entered the Screaming Coffin's containment unit. Surprisingly, the Screaming Coffin was peacefully lying in the middle of the room. I guess Winter found a way to get a corpse, Nick thought. Seeing he wasn't needed here, Nick left and stopped in front of Winter's office. A couple minutes later, Winter entered the warehouse. When he saw Nick, he was a bit surprised. Nick felt quite different from before. 3 days ago, Nick had seemed fragile and vulnerable, and 2 days before that like he was about to say the sentence. But now he seemed sturdy and serious. He had always seemed nice and light-hearted, but now he seemed like someone uninterested in hearing jokes. It was a strong transformation. Nevertheless, Winter had learned to interact with all kinds of people and to read emotions from the slightest signs. He could tell Nick was concerned right now. You noticed our new colleagues, I presume? Winter asked with a smirk. Nick furrowed his brows. New colleagues. Winter nodded and pointed at a railing at the side of the warehouse. Almost all warehouses in the outer city had some kind of metallic scaffolding with cheap stairs leading to a higher layer at the edge. That layer was a corridor of metallic grates, barely 2 meters wide, running around the sides of the warehouse. Nick looked where Winter pointed and saw a guy lifting his right hand in greeting. The guy wore a gray uniform that almost perfectly blended into the gray walls. He also carried a couple of guns. All in all, he gave off a similar vibe to the city guards, but a bit more subdued. This is one of the members of the guard team I hired, Winter said. Then he pointed elsewhere. Another should be there. Nick looked over. It took a couple of seconds, but eventually he made out the silhouette of another man. And the last one is there, Winter said, pointing again. Sure enough, Nick saw a third person. There are always 3 guards here, Winter said. We want to make sure nobody takes them out one by one, which is why they all keep each other in sight and stand on opposite sides of the warehouse. They're professionals, and they can even fight an average level 1 extractor with their weapons and tactics. And the best thing, This entire team barely costs 1,500 credits per day. Chapter 115. He has changed. When Nick saw the three guards, he felt like Dark Dream had changed. Sure, they'd already been in official business when they hired Jenny, but now Nick actually felt like Dark Dream was becoming a real one. A CEO, a chief Zephyx Extractor, 2 Zephyx Extractors, a servant, a constant presence of 3 guards. There were now quite a lot more people. So when my ability deactivated earlier, it wasn't the spy, but the guards, Nick thought as he looked at them. I should get familiar with them, Nick told Wintour. Right, we also need to talk about a couple of things, Wintour said. The unimportant ones can wait, since you need to get to work on the Dreamer soon. By the way, do you feel confident working with the Dreamer? Nick nodded wordlessly. Wintour looked at him for a bit. He seems quite confident, Wintour thought. Good to hear, Wintour said with a smile. Is there anything you need to talk to me about that can't wait until the afternoon? Nick turned to him. I want to start training with my weapons as soon as possible. Wintour raised an eyebrow. Nick hadn't seemed eager to train a couple of days ago, but now he seemed like he couldn't wait. Sure, Wintour said. When do you want the training? After lunch each day, Nick said. I'll be done with the Dreamer at 2 p.m. and lunch should barely take half an hour. I can then use another half an hour to warm up, and I should be ready to train at 3. Wintour nodded. How will you split your training? 3 days of fists and 4 days of throwing spears per week, Nick said. 3 hours per day. Wintour raised his eyebrows in surprise. 7 days a week, 3 hours every day. Are you sure you can handle that? I don't want to pay them just to talk to you. Nick nodded with conviction. I can handle that much. Wintour kept looking at him with skepticism, but after a couple of seconds staring into Nick's confident eyes, he just shrugged. If you say so, Wintour said, but if I hear you're not properly training for all 3 hours, I'll take their fees out of your salary, okay? Nick nodded. No problem. All right, Wintour said, patting Nick on the shoulder. Come to me when you're done with the Dreamer. Of course, Nick answered. Wintour smiled. It's good to have you back, Nick. Nick took a deep breath. It's good to be back, he said. At that moment, Nick wasn't sure if he was lying. In a way, he was glad he could work again, but he also felt like it didn't matter. The void in his chest made all of this seem meaningless. His feelings told him it made no difference where he was. Being in Dark Dream was the same as lying in bed. But Nick just ignored his feelings. In the last couple of days, he had become quite good at dealing with the void. It still appeared every evening when there was nothing to do, but during the day he could manage. Wintour entered his office, and Nick walked into the Dreamer's containment unit. The Dreamer looked away from Trevor and focused on Nick. Nick looked back with an even gaze. After a few seconds, the Dreamer took a couple of steps back. Nick woke Trevor, and the two talked a bit. When Trevor saw Nick, he felt mixed emotions. He was happy Nick had regained his energy, but Nick seemed to have changed. He seemed less jovial, less lighthearted, more serious. Well, he does feel like a boss now, Trevor thought with a sigh. After talking a bit more, Trevor left and Nick sat down in the corner. When the Dreamer came closer, Nick felt almost no fear. Usually he felt at least some, but not anymore. Maybe it was that he now had a barrier and weapons, or that he didn't care for his survival as much anymore. No matter the case, the truth was that Nick felt almost no fear before the Dreamer. A minute later, Nick fell asleep. Nick, wake up, he heard an instant later. As Nick opened his eyes, he saw a concerned Jenny. Are you okay? She asked with a worried expression. Why wouldn't I be? Nick asked, surprised by how shaky his voice sounded. The next moment, Nick felt something wet on his face and wiped it. Tears, he thought, looking at the wet spots on his hand. Have I been crying in my sleep? That was when he noticed several wet spots on the ground around him, too. I must have been crying a lot, judging by all these stains, Nick thought with furrowed brows. Yet I feel fine. I don't feel like I have to cry. Are you sure you're okay? Jenny asked. Nick nodded and stood. It's probably an effect of the nightmare the Dreamer put me in. Seems like some sad things happened. Don't worry about it. Jenny just looked at him with a worried expression. To her, Nick felt different. Colder and more distant. It was almost like he was afraid of getting too close to her. Jenny wanted to ask what was going on, but then she remembered their last talk. Back then, Nick had said he thought she was getting too involved in his life. He was her boss, and she was his employee. so Jenny decided against asking. After some small talk, Nick left the containment unit to check how much Zephyx had been produced. Chapter 116, Dung Heap. When Nick saw the amount of Zephyx, he sighed. As expected, the more someone suffers, the more Zephyx gets produced. Nick had produced around 15 grams, quite a bit more than before. Since he kept 20% of it, he had essentially earned 6,000 credits from just this. Usually Nick would feel overwhelmed, but the surprise and joy were extremely subdued. It just didn't feel like anything special right now. After looking at the Zephyx for a bit, Nick grabbed the containers and brought them to Wintour's office. "Thanks," Wintour said, taking the container. A moment later, Wintour calculated the worth of the Zephyx and gave Nick the money he'd earned over the last couple of days. Even though Nick hadn't been working, the other extractors had, and Nick still earned money from that. "Thanks," Nick said, pocketing the money. "By the way, your first teacher is ready to start today, since she doesn't have much to do," Wintour said. "You're fine starting today, right?" Nick thought. He had chosen fist weapons and throwing spears, and neither seemed like weapons women would choose. "Which instructor is it?" Nick asked. "The spear one," Wintour said with a chuckle. "She'll be in the warehouse in a bit less than an hour." Nick nodded with a bit of anticipation that could almost be called excitement. "I'll be there," Nick said, standing. "Nick, I need to talk to you about a couple of things," Wintour said. "I know," Nick answered. "I'm just getting something to eat. A consistent diet is part of training, and I need to eat before I start with my instructor. We can talk after I get my food." "If it's okay with you, I can get the food and eat it in here. That should save us time," Nick explained. Wintour furrowed his brows. He wasn't a fan of someone eating in his office. "Let's talk in your room then," Wintour said. "Fine with me," Nick said before leaving. Nick grabbed a cooked chicken and walked to his room. Wintour was already waiting there, and the two entered. While Nick tore the chicken apart, Wintour told him what had changed in the last couple of days. Nick simply listened, and when Wintour was done, he gave his input. "I'm fine with the corpse acquisition," Nick said. In the last couple of days, Wintour had finally finalized a deal with Crimson Fungus City. Corpses were the property of the city. Any corpse that appeared in the outer city, and the Dregs belonged to it. Naturally, since corpses could be sold for quite a lot to the Zephyx manufacturers. The baseline price was set by Anatomy, the second biggest manufacturer in the city. Anatomy's strongest Specter was the Pit of Corpses, a very strong level 5 Specter, a fanatic. The Pit of Corpses, essentially, had no limit to how many corpses it could turn into Zephyx. However, the more it got, the less efficient it became. After a lot of time, Anatomy found a sweet spot. If they bought all the corpses at 10,000 credits each, they'd still remain very profitable, and other manufacturers would have to pay more. Naturally, the others could only buy a couple of corpses at such a high price, so Anatomy still received the vast majority. If one bought corpses directly from the guards without a deal, they'd pay 15,000, since the city also wanted its cut. Luckily, Wintour had gotten a favorable deal. Every 2 days, they'd receive the corpse of one adult male for 11,000 credits. That made things much easier. First, the corpse was cheaper. Second, it was always valuable, being an adult male. These corpses tended to have more mass than those of females and children. Third, Nick wouldn't need to find targets anymore, which was good for his mental state. They wouldn't even need to leave, since the city guards would deliver the corpse to the warehouse. After the corpses, the two talked about their future plans. For now, everyone would focus on training and getting ready for battle, and in about 3 months, when everyone reached the peak of the first level, they'd start becoming more aggressive toward Artem's company. The search for a third Specter was on ice for now, since they wanted to consolidate. The more Specters they had, the more people they needed to employ, making a bigger target. They could still expand once Artem was dealt with. Wintour also told Nick about Artem's company. It was called Cycle, with a circular arrow as its symbol. Cycle was named after its strongest Specter, the Dung Heap. The Dung Heap was an adolescent Specter, making it stronger than any Specter Dark Dream owned. Artem had bought it for only 500,000 credits, insanely low for an adolescent. Even hatchlings went for at least 1 million each. The reason it was so cheap was that it barely produced any Zephyx. The Dung Heap produced Zephyx by destroying food. And food was pretty expensive in Crimson Fungus City. Worse, the bargain bin method couldn't be used since it was a possession specter. So Artem was stuck buying very expensive food to pile onto the dung heap to produce a trickle of Zephyx. Even as an adolescent, it was probably only a quarter to half as profitable as the screaming coffin. Chapter 117, Special Law. Aside from the dung heap, Artem also had 2 hatchlings, but they weren't very important. The key point was that if they dealt with Artem, they'd get all of these Specters. Naturally, Nick wanted to know how. The Specters were owned by another manufacturer, and if they suddenly appeared in Dark Dream's building, wouldn't the city accuse them of theft? Winter told Nick that wasn't the case. In the past, Cugelblitz had wanted to get rid of a competitor, and after a lot of influencing in the city's government, they passed a law. This law dictated the minimum power one needed to safeguard the populace from a captured Specter. One needed at least 1 extractor for every Specter, and each extractor had to be on the level of every Specter. Dark Dream, for example, had 2 hatchlings, which meant it needed 2 newbies, at least one of them a peak newbie. However, there were exceptions. For example, if a late or mid newbie could prove they could suppress the peak hatchling, there wouldn't be an issue. One manufacturer could request a check on another, but the check cost a lot of money. To check Dark Dream, one would need to pay 1,000,000 credits. If a check was requested, a team employed by Crimson Fungus City would arrive and inspect all the different Specters. If the manufacturer was deemed strong enough, the team would leave, and the other manufacturer would have lost its credits. But if the manufacturer couldn't show the power required, it would be forced to disband, and its Specters handed over to another. Almost always, the manufacturer that requested the check had a couple of empty containment units ready along with extra employees, and since they'd paid for the check, they almost always got the Specters. So what did this mean in concrete numbers? If Artem managed to kill Nick, he could request a check. Winter wouldn't be strong enough to suppress the Dreamer alone, and the other 2 extractors were still too weak. Their abilities also weren't suited for combat. On the other hand, if Dark Dream got rid of the second John in Cycle and killed all the newbies, they'd get all of Cycle's Specters. It was important to note that they couldn't purposefully kill Artem himself. Artem was one of the potential heirs of the Melfian family, and even if he was supposed to prove himself worthy, the family wouldn't be happy seeing one of their sons killed. While nothing would happen to Winter, whoever killed Artem would most likely be killed by the Melfian family. As a John himself, Artem could represent the dung heap, but not the 2 hatchlings. But as long as they killed enough of his men, they'd still get everything. Artem was only one man, and he had 3 Specters. For quite a while, Nick and Winter planned through all kinds of scenarios. At some point, they would clash with Cycle. With Artem's arrogance, he probably thought Dark Dream didn't even know he was spying on them. Winter assured Nick that Artem's head was so far up his own ass, he was defying physical laws. As long as they played dumb, Artem would believe himself in control. For now, they'd act like they didn't know someone from Artem's company was spying. After a lot of talking, Nick said he had to go. It was about time for his first lesson. Nick and Winter went back to Dark Dream. When they entered the warehouse, they saw a new person. "Yes, Stan," Winter asked the guy running up to him. It was a man with dark hair wearing a gray suit. And right now, he seemed like he'd seen a Specter. His eyes were wide open, and his face had turned pale. "Sir, there was nothing we could do," she was. "Calm down," Winter said forcefully. Stan looked at Winter with a worried expression, glancing toward the back of the warehouse. "Mainla, I guess this is your doing?" Winter asked. They were weak. Nick and Winter looked up at one of the scaffoldings and saw someone leaning on a railing. When Nick saw her, he took a deep breath. She was big. The person was over 190 centimeters tall. Her hair was light brown, and her skin also had a very brown tone. Nick would have thought she was a man if well. Her front was also very big. A moment later, Nick noticed the emblems on her uniform. She wore the bloody red uniform of a Zephyx Extractor from Cugelblitz, and Nick could see the picture of a 3-headed mushroom on her chest. The mushroom was struck by 3 lightning bolts, signifying her level. She was a level 3 Zephyx Extractor, a veteran. And not just any veteran. She was a veteran employed by the most powerful Zephyx manufacturer in Crimson Fungus City, Cugelblitz. This person was most likely extremely powerful, even for a veteran. The next moment, the tall woman jumped over the railing and comfortably landed on the ground, making almost no sound. "Crack!" Nick heard the distant sound of something scraping the warehouse walls and looked over. On one wall was a metallic spear embedded. Nick remembered this was one of the guards' positions. Luckily, he didn't see a corpse. Shing! A moment later, a tiny silver thread reflected in the air, and the spear shot out of the wall. Clink! And neatly landed in the tall woman's right hand. Nick took a deep breath. Chapter 118, Mainla. Mainla, the tall woman, walked up to Wintour and nodded in greeting. Nick looked at her with quite a bit of awe. She was so tall and strong, and her demeanor so confident. Nick had never seen anyone like this in the Dregs. "I presume you had your fun," Wintour asked with a sigh. "Yes," Mainla said with a confident nod, "but your guards are no good. They didn't even notice me until I showed myself. You need better ones." The guards heard her. Usually they would have protested, but this time they kept quiet. Yes, they were very good at what they did, but this was a veteran from Kugelblitz. Of course, they weren't up to her standards. If they were, they wouldn't be working for a small client like Dark Dream. "They're more than good enough for what I pay them," Wintour said with a friendly smile. "If I hired guards you'd be fine with, I'd lose more money than I make." Mainla looked unimpressed, but Nick could see she understood. The next moment she glanced at Nick. Nick raised an eyebrow. Mainla furrowed her brows. "Is that the guy?" she asked. "Yes, this is Nick, my chief Zephyx Extractor," Wintour said, gesturing to him. "Chief Zephyx Extractor," Mainla repeated with disgust. When she heard it, the image of her own Chief Zephyx Extractor in Kugelblitz shot through her mind, a level 6 Zephyx Extractor, a hero. Compared to that person, Nick seemed like a child. "Officially, I guess the title is accurate," Mainla said. Nick took a deep breath. "Silence." "You're not going to ask?" Mainla asked. "No," Nick said, "I know what you mean." "HMPH," Mainla uttered, looking at Nick a bit more. "Well, money is money, I suppose." Nick nodded and held out his hand for a handshake. "Nice to be working with you." Mainla looked at the hand with furrowed brows. "What are you doing?" "Shaking hands," Nick said matter-of-factly. "Isn't that how you people from the inner city greet each other?" Mainla's eyes narrowed. Nick raised an eyebrow. Did he do something wrong? Wintour awkwardly cleared his throat. "Nick, a handshake is more for interactions between businesses. Unless they're in an official meeting, extractors generally don't greet each other like that." "You can tell him," Mainla said. "You don't need to lie for me." Wintour coughed again. "And Mainla isn't from the inner city. She used to live in the outer city." "Oh," Nick said, pulling his arm back. "I didn't know." Mainla just looked at him. "You smell of chicken," she said. Nick wasn't sure where she was going. "Yes, I eat them every day." "Are they good?" she asked. "Very," Nick said. "They're the best thing I've ever eaten." Mainla raised an eyebrow. Nick didn't seem to be lying. Then a casual smile formed on her face. "Thanks. My mother raises the ones they sell here, and my father slaughters them. Your appreciation for the chickens is why they're still working to this day." Nick blinked in surprise, thinking back to the chickens he'd eaten. Mainla's parents raised and slaughtered them. "The chickens taste amazing," Nick said with a nod. "Thanks," Mainla said with a small smile. But then her face turned into a solemn frown. "We don't have time for this," she said. Nick nodded. They weren't here to talk about chickens. "Get your spears," Mainla commanded. "I have one," Nick said, taking it out. Clank. Mainla slapped the spear aside, and it fell to the ground. "Get your entire set," she ordered. "I heard you got a set of 5. Get them all. Leave your vambraces in your room." Mainla had already noticed why Nick wasn't carrying all his spears. The single one she'd thrown aside was already far too heavy for someone like him. A set of 5 would be brutal to carry, and with his fist weapons too, things would only get worse. "Of course," Nick said, turning to leave. "Take your spear with you," Mainla commanded. Nick furrowed his brows. He'd come back here anyway. Why take it? "Show respect to the craftsmanship," Mainla explained, seeing his expression. "A spear is only supposed to remain in 3 places when not in use. On your back, stabbed into something, or lying on a clean surface. You can stab your spear into the warehouse floor since that's what a spear is for, but you're not allowed to leave it lying on such dirty ground." Mainla flicked her fingers, and the spear on the ground flew into her hand. Crack! The next moment, she flicked Nick's spear downward, and it perfectly stabbed into the ground. "That's okay," she said. Then she kicked it, and it fell to the ground. That's not okay. Show respect to the craftsmanship, Nick thought. He thought about how he'd feel if he produced something with all his passion, and then saw it thrown in the dirt with disregard. I probably wouldn't mind, but I can see how someone would view this as disrespectful, Nick thought. Okay, Nick said, bending down and lifting the spear. After putting it on his back, he left the warehouse. Meanwhile, Mainla looked at Wintour. He's malleable, she said. That's good. Wintour nodded. I see a lot of potential in him. Silence. You don't agree? Wintour asked. Mainla looked at the exit with furrowed brows. I don't know. He is malleable, and I can see a fire burning inside him. But he also gives me a certain feeling I've felt from many of my colleagues. It's like he's fighting a hopeless battle, and he knows it deep inside. He seems too idealistic. People like this don't tend to live long. Chapter 119, Lesson. A minute later, Nick came back to Dark Dream. He put his cuffs away, but the weight of all 5 spears was almost crushing him. Mainla could see how much Nick suffered under the weight. She had no idea why Wintour bought him such a heavy, advanced set. These spears seemed far too heavy for someone of Nick's level. However, Mainla knew most of an extractor's power came from their ability. Most likely, the weight of Nick's spears was related to his. Mainla knew Wintour wasn't dumb. He'd spent a couple of days in her department a couple of years ago, learning how to run a proper manufacturer. Let's go, Mainla said, walking past Nick and out of the warehouse. Go where? Nick asked. Training spot, she said. We can't throw spears in here. Oh right, Nick said, walking after her. Have fun, Wintour shouted before going back to his office. Mainla and Nick walked through the streets. Many people looked at Mainla with respect and shock. A veteran from Kugelblitz. And she was huge. It was almost like a bronze goddess of war walking through the streets. Mainla didn't say anything as they walked, but her speed slowly picked up. Nick already had trouble walking at a normal pace, and it only got worse as she sped up. Nick gritted his teeth and sped up too. The sound of his footsteps was extremely loud, reverberating through the streets. After a while, the two reached the entrance to the Dregs. The next moment, Nick saw Mainla casually jump on top of a 2-story building. She looked back, motioning for him to come up. Nick looked at her with furrowed brows. He could barely walk with all this weight. How was he supposed to get on top of a building? Nick looked around but saw no stairs. The wall was also very flat. There were no smaller buildings within reach. If his ability activated, or if he didn't carry his spears, he'd have no issue getting up. Sadly, it was the middle of the day, so people were always looking his way, and he was obviously supposed to bring his spears. Mainla just kept looking at him without a word. Nick thought for a bit. A couple of seconds later, he walked to the entrance and loudly knocked. Anyone in there? No answer. Hello? No answer. If you don't open, your house might get damaged. No answer. The door gave way, since it had never been locked. Nick hesitated, shrugged, and entered. After looking through the house, he found no sign of anyone living there. This house was at the border between the outer city and the Dregs. Most likely, nobody lived here. While it was officially part of the Dregs, the guards weren't fans of the stinky people from the Dregs and didn't like them living this close to the outer city. Because of that, almost all houses at the border were empty, and this was probably one of them. Good to know, Nick thought with a nod. Nick walked out again and looked at Mainla, who was still watching wordlessly. Can I throw my spears to you? He asked. Mainla's brows furrowed. She didn't immediately answer. What if I say no? She asked. That's also fine, Nick said. Silence. Show me, she ordered. All right, Nick said. He took out one spear and stabbed it into the ground beside him. He did the same with the next 3. Nick grabbed the last spear with both hands and stabbed it into the wall of the house. Then he grabbed another and stabbed it higher into the house by throwing it. After doing that 5 times, he created a small staircase. Mainla had said it was fine if the spears were stuck in something. So this should be okay. After climbing to the second spear, Nick put his legs around it and let his upper body fall. Like this, he could easily grab the first spear. When he got it, he walked all the way to the top and stabbed it into the roof. Mainla watched wordlessly as Nick went back down for the second spear. A couple seconds later, Nick was on top of the building with all his spears. Impressive, Mainla said. Thanks, Nick said. I don't think you know what I meant, she added. Nick blinked. What did you mean? Your question earlier, Mainla said. You asked if you could pass your spears to me. Yeah, what about it? Nick asked. I've done this with a couple of people, but you're the first to actually ask for help without giving up, she said. Huh, Nick uttered. This was supposed to teach you two things. First, that throwing spears are more than just weapons. You can use them in many ways. And second, that we are not alone as Zephyx Extractors. As Zephyx Extractors, we always work together. We are a team. Even in battle, we go together. So asking for help is not wrong, and even encouraged. Tasks that seem very difficult can easily be overcome by working with someone else, and refusing help is often very stupid. You're the first to actually ask for assistance like this. Most of the time, if the person doesn't find the solution, they just give up. They see asking me for help as giving up, when it's actually the point of the lesson. Nick blinked. Then why did you ask what I'd do if you said no? I wanted to know what you had planned, Mainla said. You went into the house to see if someone lived there, which means you were probably planning on damaging it. I wanted to see what would happen. Oh, Nick said. Well, originally I wanted to throw my spear up and let it land in the roof, but it was too heavy to throw that far, so I went with this. Mainla looked at him for a couple more seconds. Then she nodded. All right, let's continue, she said, holding out her hand. Nick grabbed it and shook it. Mainla looked at him with a deadpan expression. Give me your spears, I'll hold them for you. Nick stopped shaking her hand. Oh, okay. Chapter 120, Collecting. For the next couple of minutes, the two jumped from building to building. Eventually, Mainla stopped, and Nick looked at the place in front of him. Ruins. They stood on the highest building around, 4 stories high. In front of them were half-destroyed and completely destroyed houses for nearly 50 meters. Many of the plates and grates were completely ruined, exposing the sewers. In a way, the area looked like an ancient ruin in a swamp, except the swamp was made of even more disgusting water. Can you tell what destroyed all these buildings? Mainla asked. Nick looked around. After a while, he noticed many round holes in the destroyed buildings. Something round and strong, Nick said. Mainla grabbed one of Nick's spears and threw it. Shing! Nick's eyes shot open in shock as his spear perfectly passed through one of the holes. This was my training ground, Mainla said, the only place in the outer city where I can practice throwing my spears. Nick looked at the destroyed buildings. Mainla must have thrown countless spears. Get your spear. You need to get familiar with this place anyway, she said. Nick took a deep breath and nodded. Hold up, Mainla said, holding out his other spears. Don't forget these. Nick took another deep breath. Of course, he said, putting them on his back. Immediately, he felt heavy again. As he looked at the destroyed building again, it seemed much farther away. He was on top of a 4-story building, while the spear had shot through a hole in one of the small houses. On top of that, the grates on the streets would never hold Nick's weight plus the spears. This meant he needed to jump from building to building while carrying them. It was essentially impossible. But Nick remembered his previous lesson and what Mainla had said. Throwing spears were not only weapons. Eventually, Nick made a route in his mind. First, he climbed down the building by dropping 3 of his spears. By dropping them, he could control how they landed, and all 3 stabbed into the roof of the smaller building beside this one. Then Nick jumped down and stabbed the last spear into the wall. Since he didn't weigh much without his spears, the wall held. After that, he pulled the spear out and dropped onto the roof. With his physique, he could withstand the drop. A moment later, Nick gathered the spears and left to get his lost one. Mainla had never said he couldn't set his spears aside. Without them, it was easy to jump from building to building. About a minute later, Nick entered the destroyed building and found his spear stabbed into the ground. Returning wasn't difficult either, but the climb to the top of the tall building wasn't easy. Nick used the same method as the first lesson, but due to the building's greater size, he needed to jump much more. Eventually he did it and arrived at the top with all his spears. Mainla wordlessly walked over and took one spear. Shing! And threw it through the same hole. Nice going, smartass. Now do the same but take your spears with you, she said. Nick took a very deep breath to calm down. Of course, he said. I don't want to see you drop your spears, Mainla said. If they leave your person, it had better be to act as a foothold or something similar. As Nick looked at the route he needed to take, he grew worried. With the added weight, that route was now impossible. There were too many big jumps. This time, it took Nick almost 5 minutes to come up with a new route, and it was long. The spear was barely 40 meters away, but he'd need to traverse over 200 to reach it. Climbing down the tall building was the first problem. With so many spears on him, the wall couldn't resist his weight if he held onto a single one. But Nick found a solution. He jumped down and stabbed one spear into the building. Before he fully stopped, he let go and continued falling. And stabbed in the second spear. Eventually, Nick had put all 4 spears into the wall. Without a spear on his back, he could climb up to the highest one, retrieve it, and fall to the second. The second held the combined weight of Nick and 1 spear, but the third quickly broke off the wall when he dropped onto it with 2. Luckily, it still slowed his fall, and eventually Nick broke through all the spears and landed on the ground. His bones and muscles hurt, but he could still move. Then the arduous journey began. Nick used his spears to close the gaps between buildings while retrieving them. He needed to balance on them. He even used them to break down a wall. It took Nick over 40 minutes to reach his original spear and retrieve it. Then the long journey back began. The way back was even harder with an additional spear, and it took another 30 minutes. Finally, Nick arrived on top of the building. Mainla grabbed one of the spears and threw it through a different hole in a different building. Next one. Nick took a deep breath. He'd expected to learn how to throw spears. Instead, Mainla was throwing, and he was collecting. Chapter 121, Ability. For the next 2 hours, Nick had to collect 3 more spears, each harder to get than the last. By the end, he felt like he was about to die. His arms were nearly unusable, and his back ached whenever he tried to straighten up. When he reached the top of the building again, Mainla nodded at him. "Good work, that should be enough for today," she said. Nick breathed with difficulty and only nodded. By now, he had realized why Mainla had made him do these things. First, he became familiar with his new training spot. Second, he was undergoing arduous physical training, which should improve his strength. Third, he was getting used to the weight of his spears and learning to carry them without using up too much power. Fourth, he was getting very familiar with his spears. The way he handled them now was far easier and more skillful than before. He'd also gotten used to creating footholds with his spears and using them to reach terrain he otherwise couldn't. Funnily enough, even though his task hadn't been to throw spears, he'd needed to throw them more than once, and each throw needed a different target. Sometimes they needed to pierce a wall below him. Sometimes a wall above. Sometimes the ground far away. And sometimes the ceiling. Since a wrong throw would cause huge issues, every throw was careful and calculated. If one of his spears bounced off a wall, it would fall toward the broken grates and into the sewers. If a spear fell into the sewers, Nick would have to get it back. The spears were too valuable to leave. And Mainla would probably become quite angry if he left one in such a dirty place. Nick needed to be extremely careful with his throws, and that had already made him much better at them. All in all, the training had been quite effective. "Same time tomorrow," Mainla said, "but this time we'll meet here." "Of course, thank you," Nick said through difficult pants. Mainla nodded once more and jumped off the building toward the outer city. She was extremely silent and made no noise, even though she'd probably jumped over 50 meters. Even when she landed, she made no sound. Is that her ability? Nick thought. My spears already weigh 30 kilos each, and they're made from mid to peak Johns. She's a powerful veteran, which means her spears are even heavier. Nick saw 7 thin spears on Mainla's retreating back. She's probably walking around with over 300 kilos of extra weight. Yet she makes no sound when she moves. It's almost like she's a ghost. Or a specter. Nick watched Mainla until he couldn't see her anymore. Then he took a deep breath. A moment later, his spears suddenly became very easy to carry. His ability had activated. Nick easily jumped down the building. With his stronger body, he'd have no issue withstanding the fall. Nick calmly fell. Boom! But then his eyes widened in shock as the ceiling he landed on broke into pieces. Fug, Nick thought. He landed on the floor below, and since the ceiling had slowed his fall, he didn't break the floor too. However, half the roof of the building was broken. How the fuck did she do that? Nick thought as he pushed the bent metallic rubble aside. She should weigh 3 times as much as me, but the building she landed on didn't show any signs of breaking. After climbing out, Nick jumped from building to get back, much more careful now. For the rest of the day, Nick ate some food and trained with his melee weapons. The next day, after working with the Dreamer, Nick grabbed lunch and moved to the training field again. It was easy to get there since nobody saw him once he reached the rooftops, but when the 4-story building came into view, things got difficult. Nick didn't see Mainla, but he could tell she was there, since his ability had deactivated. Traveling across the rooftops became problematic again. Eventually, Nick reached the top of the big building, but... "You're late," Mainla complained with narrowed eyes. "Sorry," Nick said. "I forgot about the difficult path here. I'll start earlier tomorrow." Mainla snorted in annoyance. "How could you forget? You should have known how far you needed to travel and what you'd carry. Clearly, you knew how long it would take." Nick took a deep breath. "I would have come 10 minutes early with the use of my ability." Mainla frowned. "I don't need to know about your ability," she said. "If you tell me, it would seem like I coerced you with my superior power, and my motives would be called into question." "I don't want to know what ability you have," she said. Nick nodded, "Of course." Mainla nodded too, and turned to the training field. "But you don't seem to mind," Nick added. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Your ability," Nick said. "How else would you be able to stay so silent while jumping so far with so much extra weight?" "That's not an ability," Mainla said. Nick's brows rose in shock. "It's not." "No," Mainla confirmed. "Then can I learn that?" Nick asked. "It's on your training plan," Mainla said. "It's not a focus, but it's part of your training." "That is well." Nick just looked at her with confusion. "What is well?" The next moment, Mainla gestured toward Nick's side with her head. Then Nick saw one of her spears stuck in the roof, just 2 centimeters from his left foot. This spear hadn't been there. He hadn't heard or felt anything. How did it appear there? Chapter 122, Advantageous Disadvantage. "How did this spear get here?" Nick asked in shock. "You're going to learn how to do that later," Mainla said, opening her right hand. Nick was about to shake it again, but he remembered yesterday. Instead, he just awkwardly looked at it, not knowing what to do. "My spear," she said. "Hand it to me." "Oh, sure," Nick said quickly, grabbing the spear. Then he pulled it out with all his power. Whoop! And nearly fell over as the spear easily and neatly came out of the roof. "It's so light, that's probably only 5 to 7 kilos. Nick had expected something like 50 to 70. Awkwardly, Nick placed the spear in Mainla's hand, and she took it. The next moment, the spear shrank in her hand. The tip compressed and entered the shaft, making the spear less than 10 centimeters long. The next moment, she slid it down her sleeve. Without Nick asking, Mainla unbuttoned her right sleeve, showing him her wrist. There were 6 compact spears around it. Then she flicked her wrist, and one flew into her open hand and expanded back to full size. "Not every spear needs to be equally strong," she said. "The spears on my back are for strong and durable targets, but they're not as silent. If you want to focus on throwing spears, you have to buy multiple sets for different purposes." Mainla looked at the spears on Nick's back. "The ones on your back are for single-target assassinations and direct heavy battle. They're not made for quick, nimble targets." Nick nodded in understanding. "Time to warm up," Mainla said as she took all 5 of Nick's spears. Xiang, 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 xiang. Within 3 seconds, all 5 landed on different houses in the training area. "Get them within 20 minutes. If you can't, you'll try again," she said. Nick took a deep breath and jumped down the building. Without his spears, he became quite agile and fast. But he quickly found something that surprised him. Right now, Nick stood before a gap 5 meters wide, with a 3-story building on the other side. He was on a building only 1 story high. Except for the small holes left by his spears yesterday, the wall was smooth. For a while, Nick looked at the wall in shock. This whole time, he'd viewed his spears as a drawback due to their weight. But right now, he couldn't climb that building. Climbing it with his spears was easy, since he only needed to make a small ladder, but without them, it became extremely difficult. Traversing the rooftops had become harder without his spears. Nick would never have thought this would happen. He almost always used this building as a central checkpoint to reach every other one, since it was in the middle. But this time, he couldn't climb it. He needed at least 2 spears to get on top. "I can't waste time here," Nick thought before changing his route. Originally, Nick wanted to get the farthest spear first, since every spear added weight, but now he'd get that one last. About 10 minutes later, Nick retrieved 3 spears and reached the top of the tall building. 5 minutes later, he retrieved the last spear. Now he only needed to get back. He reached the starting point. 23 minutes after starting. So close. Without a word, Mainla threw the 5 spears to the same spots again. This time Nick knew what to do, and he was faster. 21 minutes. Once again. 20 minutes and 28 seconds. And again. 20 minutes and 42 seconds. Once more. Over 21 minutes. Nick breathed heavily. He'd already used up almost all his power in the previous attempts. Jumping from building to building with so much weight was extremely exhausting. Nick knew he wouldn't finish the task today. But when he saw Mainla's strict gaze, he knew giving up was the wrong move. He also remembered he'd have to pay for the lesson if she felt he was wasting her time. So he had to keep trying. But since he couldn't win anyway, he took the time to study the route from the top of the building instead of immediately jumping down. He used it to optimize his route for tomorrow. A couple of minutes later, Nick raised an eyebrow as he noticed something. There was another, much faster way to get 2 of his spears, and the reason he'd never found it was that he'd been planning his route with his spears in mind. The original route was to go 10 meters toward the center, 20 meters right, get 1 spear, travel back to the center, go 30 meters left, get the next, go back to the center, and climb the big building with the spears. But with the new route, Nick could run around the battlefield in a circle. From the south, the starting point, he could go east, then north, then west, grab spear number 2, turn around, grab number 5, number 4, number 1, and then go to the center for the last. It would be much faster. Nick took a deep breath and jumped down. He followed the new route and came back after 23 minutes. But Nick had also spent over 5 minutes planning it. After starting once more, Nick got through the exercise in just under 20 minutes. He'd done it. Chapter 123, Peak. Nick reached the top of the building and breathed heavily as he collapsed onto his knees. He'd never been this exhausted. "Well done," Mainla said. "I thought it would take until the end of the lesson, but we still have about half an hour left." "Take a break for 2 minutes," she said. Nick didn't answer and just kept breathing with difficulty. When the 2 minutes were up, he had somewhat recovered. Shing! And the 5 spears shot to the same places again. "One last time," Mainla said. "If you do it in time again, you'll get a surprise." Nick took a deep breath. Again. His bones already hurt from the constant falls, and his muscles pressing on them. His body was shouting at him that what he was doing was dangerous, and he needed to stop. This was too much, and it might become dangerous. But Nick only took a deep breath. If it were just himself, he'd never do something this risky. But he trusted Mainla. She seemed like an honest person, and too intelligent to make him do this without a good reason. Nick trusted in her character and experience. So he jumped down almost immediately. As soon as he started running, he felt slower than before. His exhaustion had hit him full force. But he just kept jumping. Crack! Nick slipped, and his knee hit the roof he was on. It hurt quite a bit, and his knee made weird sounds whenever he moved it, but he gnashed his teeth and continued. Despite the odds, Nick managed the jumps he needed. Eventually, he retrieved all the spears. He felt like he was about to collapse, but he still accurately threw them into the tall building before climbing up and retrieving them again. Finally, he arrived, and immediately fell to the ground, breathing heavily. He was done. So done. He didn't care about the time anymore. He was just done. "A bit slower than expected," Mainla said. Nick didn't care. "It took you 18 minutes and 36 seconds. That took Nick by surprise. What?" he asked through heavy pants. 18 minutes and 36 seconds, Mainla repeated. "That's your time." Nick almost couldn't believe it, but how, he asked. "Don't act too surprised," Mainla said. "That's still quite slow for a peak newbie." "But I'm—" That was when Nick realized. "And that's your surprise," Mainla said. "I broke through," Nick asked in confusion. Mainla nodded. "You can reach the next level after accumulating about 80% of the Zephyx necessary. In your case, you seem to have somewhere between 93% and 96% of what you needed to become a peak newbie. You can view Zephyx as a pile of stones, and you advance a level when the pile reaches a certain height. By putting more stones on it, it will eventually get there. But you can also force it to that height if you put in a lot of effort to realign the stones. Our bodies use up Zephyx as fuel, and a higher level simply means you produce and use more. The stored Zephyx in your body acts as a magnet to attract more prefix, and if it attracts enough, it disperses into your body, and the amount of prefix absorbed in a given time frame stays at the early peak. In short, even if you break through with less Zephyx, you'll have just as much as someone who broke through with all of it. By forcing yourself to the absolute brink, you manage to absorb enough prefix to push over the edge. That's how you broke through. Nick listened with rapt attention. That was possible. He could break through earlier. How exactly can I achieve that? Nick asked. Very strong stimulus, Mainla answered. Most commonly, a dire situation. If you feel like you're about to die, your survival instinct can give you the push. If you feel you have to save a loved one with all your power, you can get that push. In your case, it was simply trying very hard to finish the course. Of course, that can't compare to a life-and-death fight, but you also had more Zephyx. 80% is what's been observed in experiments where extractors were put up against Specters in battle. It might go even lower, but we don't have data for that. In short, since you already had something like 95% of the required Zephyx, it wasn't very difficult to force it, Mainla explained. Nick absorbed the knowledge like a dry sponge. Right now, reaching a new level didn't require a lot of time, but that wouldn't last. With this method, he could probably save years in the future. Thank you for telling me, Nick said through exhausted pants. Everyone knows that, Mainla answered. It's nothing special. Nick didn't answer. Anyway, we're done for today, Mainla said. You're too exhausted to do anything but lie on the ground, and if you tried to throw your spears in this condition, you might throw one into the sewers. I'll note the remaining 10 or so minutes and add them another day. For now, we're done. See you tomorrow. Nick slowly forced himself to sit up. Thanks, he said in exhaustion. Mainla just nodded and silently jumped away. Nick collapsed onto his back again and just looked at the sun. It didn't hurt to look, since its beams weren't that bright. For the next 20 minutes, Nick just lay on top of the building. And then he went home. Luckily, his ability was active again, making it easy. Chapter 124, Ghost Wire. When Nick came home, his muscles ached all over. It had never been this bad. Nevertheless, he forced himself to get some food before falling into bed. This time he slept over 9 hours, quite a lot for him, and as soon as he woke, his body had completely recovered. Nick still remembered that his body had been sore for several days before he'd become an official Zephyx Extractor. If things were still like that, his muscles would have ached for up to a week, based on the pain he'd felt. And yet it had taken only a couple of hours. Although it might not be that surprising. Specters could recover from fatal injuries within days, and Extractors grew more powerful using the same power as the Specters, the Zephyx. In a way, it was to be expected that an Extractor's recovery rate also increased. Maybe, at some point, it would even be possible to recover lost limbs without restoration liquid. After finishing his work, Nick walked toward the training area again. This time it was much easier, since he'd already made a pathway to his goal, and he was now a peak newbie. In the end, he arrived 10 minutes before training was supposed to start. Surprisingly, Mainla was already here too. Since we ended early yesterday, we're going to start early today, she said. Nick nodded. Without another word, Mainla grabbed Nick's 5 spears and threw them toward the same locations. Less than 20 minutes go. Nick nodded and immediately started. Fully recovered, he was much faster, completing everything in barely 15 minutes. His breathing had quickened, but he wasn't close to exhausted. Sure enough, this just counted as a warm-up. Today we're focusing on this, Mainla said, holding an empty hand in front of her. Nick looked at it in confusion. On what? He asked. Mainla swung her hand around a bit, and Nick felt something hit his cheek. But the thing was extremely light. That was when he remembered seeing an almost invisible wire when Mainla had thrown one of her spears the first time he'd met her. After focusing on her hand, Nick could actually see a tiny wire. Take it, she said, putting it in his right hand. Look at it. For a while, Nick inspected the wire. It was extremely light, so light he almost couldn't feel it. Yet it was extremely durable. Nick didn't use all his power, but he used quite a lot, and the thin wire didn't seem to take any damage. Even more, the tiny wire was beginning to cut into his hand. It was bizarre that something this thin could be so durable. "It's called a ghost wire, and it's used for many things," Mainla said after a while. "No normal material can be that durable while being that thin, which makes its origin obvious," she added. Nick nodded. "It comes from a specter." Mainla nodded back. The Fear Queen is a normal-sized black widow that likes to put as much fear as possible into her victims. She usually restricts them with her silk and injects them with poisons that cause extreme fear and euphoria. This wire is a couple of her strings of silk rolled into a single form. As an adult specter, the Fear Queen is very powerful, and her silk just as much. "You can keep that one and these 4, Mainla said, taking out 4 more stacks of wire. Nick looked at them in surprise. "That sounds expensive," he said. "Your boss paid for them. They're officially yours," Mainla said. Nick didn't feel comfortable with Wintour giving him even more. He felt like Wintour was giving him far more than he gave back, which made him feel guilty. He almost felt like he was taking advantage of Wintour. But in the end, Nick could only sigh, "Thanks." For the next 3 hours, Mainla taught Nick about the ghost wire and how to use it. There were many things he could do with such a durable wire. For example, he could hang it between 2 buildings at neck height, and nobody would notice before running straight into it. But the most important thing for Nick was its ability to retrieve his spears. He hadn't noticed before, but there was a very thin hole at the side of his throwing spears. This hole was made specifically for ghost wires. By threading the ghost wire through it, Nick essentially created a long, invisible leash for his spear. Each ghost wire was around 100 meters long, which meant he could retrieve his spears as long as he didn't throw them farther. If he wanted to throw them farther, he'd just let go of the wire and retrieve the spear the traditional way. For today, Nick kept dropping his spears from the house and retrieving them with the wire. It was surprisingly difficult to make the spears shoot back without hitting anything on the way. But eventually, Nick retrieved them consistently without issues. When it was almost time to end for the day, Mainla told Nick to retrieve his 5 spears once more. Naturally, she detached the ghost wires first. After Nick got the first spear back, he quickly attached the ghost wire, which took under 10 seconds, and after that, everything changed. He no longer needed to consider how to retrieve a spear after throwing it, since he could just reel it in. That made everything so much easier, and his movements became far more fluent. In the end, he barely needed 9 minutes to complete the course. Chapter 125, Throws. A day passed, and the last day of throwing spear training took place. This was Nick's 4th day of training with throwing spears, and today he'd focus on actually throwing them. But the best thing was that Nick no longer feared messing up his throws. He could travel everywhere with his spears, and if he threw one somewhere he didn't want, he could just tug the ghost wire to get it back. The first thing he had to do was run to the 5 spots again, but this time Mainla didn't throw his spears away. She just wanted Nick to reach the 5 spots while carrying all of them. That made things different, but Nick still completed the task in about 10 minutes. And then it was time for the actual training. "There are many ways to throw a spear," Mainla said, taking out one of her own. She lifted it with one hand and took a couple of steps forward. She pulled it back, took a couple more steps and threw it. Boom! The roof the 2 stood on shook as Mainla threw. Nick watched in awe as the spear seemed to shoot into the horizon. 1 second it had been there, and the next it seemed to have traveled into the sun. Of course, it didn't actually reach the sun. "Watch," Mainla said, lifting her hand. Then she pulled back. Bang! And Mainla suddenly flew into the horizon too. Nick's eyes widened in shock. She didn't fly as fast or far as her spear, but she still flew probably over 200 meters. In the distance, Nick saw Mainla catch her spear again, and that was when he realized what had happened. Mainla had gathered an incredible amount of power and thrown her spear with all of it. Then she tugged her extremely long ghost wire. With her power, she completely stopped the force of the throw and even put in enough to make the spear shoot back. Of course, the force of the throw had to go somewhere, which was why Mainla's body shot into the distance. In the end, her spear returned, and she simply landed on a roof. Surprisingly, the roof didn't collapse. A couple of seconds later, Mainla returned to the top of the tall building. "That was a full throw," she explained. "As the name suggests, it uses all your power. The tricky part is dealing with the force when you have a ghost wire attached. Without it, It's just a normal throw, but with it, things get tricky. Imagine you attack someone 30 meters away with a full throw, and they sidestep. If there's no building within the next 70 meters and your throw was strong enough, your ghost wire will pull you forward, right into your enemy's arms. But as you saw, it can also be used to traverse great distances. I can jump high and far, but not that high and far. Of course, if I'd actually wanted to go as far as possible, I would have jumped forward after throwing. When facing an enemy, you'll rarely make a full throw. The preparation is long, and the enemy will most likely hear your loud steps. You can only use it when you're very far away or when an ally is distracting the enemy. Nick nodded. Next, Mainla said, lifting her spear again. Then she performed the same throwing motion, but without steps. The spear didn't fly as fast, and Mainla was only pulled forward about 20 meters when she tugged the ghost wire. Naturally, this throw couldn't compare to the previous one. This is a stand throw, Mainla said after jumping back. It's most commonly used when your enemy doesn't see you and you're not far away. In your case, about 30 to 70 meters, assuming an appropriate level of power for your spears. It's very silent, but it still needs some preparation. You have to assume a throwing stance while pulling your arm all the way back. Nick nodded. There wasn't much to say about the stand throw. Ding! Suddenly, Mainla's body shook a bit, and Nick saw a spear shoot at her from a distance. She easily caught it and showed it to Nick. That was a hidden throw, she said. This one isn't relevant to you yet, but I still want to show you. The next moment, Mainla slowly demonstrated what she'd done. She stood in front of Nick with her arms crossed, then slowly angled one wrist backward. Nick saw one of the small spears in her sleeve come out, stopping at the tips of her fingers. Mainla pulled her wrist back more, drawing the small spear with it. An instant later, one end of the spear pointed at Nick. And then she just moved her wrist rapidly forward. Bang! The quiet sound of something solid hitting something solid rang through the air, and Nick saw the center of the spear rapidly coming closer. One had to remember that the tip had been pulled into the shaft, but now it was rapidly extending. An instant later, a long spear shot past Nick's head before being pulled back. Now I'm doing it with real speed again, Mainla said. Bang! Nick didn't even see her wrist move before the spear shot past him again. The throw isn't very strong, but strong enough to kill someone on my level if they don't have their barrier active, Mainla explained. Since you don't have hidden spears, you can't properly use the hidden throw. Chapter 126, Mask. There's one last throw, Mainla said, taking out one of her bigger spears again. The next moment, she lowered her arm and threw the spear from her hip. The power seemed nearly as strong as the stand throw. This throw is interchangeable with the stand throw and is called the hip throw. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. The hip throw is just as strong as the stand throw but faster. If you're in the air, for some reason, it's also much better, and you don't need to assume as obvious a stance. The problem is that aiming is much harder and you can't control the power as well. If you have space and time, the stand throw is always preferable, but if you don't, you're almost forced into the hip throw. The hip throw is mainly used when you're actively battling someone charging at you. Someone who wants to get into your melee range will zigzag and approach rapidly while you retreat. In that case, you have to use the hip throw, since the stand throw is too obvious. Although, since you're also training in fist weapons, you might not use the hip throw much. Nick nodded, probably not. For now, Mainla continued, I'm going to teach you the full throw. Going through the most extravagant throw first will make it easier to learn the others later. For the next couple of minutes, Mainla taught Nick the full throw, which wasn't very difficult. After all, it was just throwing an object. Every human has thrown objects. Nick kept practicing for the next 3 hours, but compared to Mainla, he didn't take off. One had to remember that his spears were designed to be thrown, with much more power. With Mainla watching, Nick couldn't throw properly. With a full throw, he could barely throw his spear 10 to 20 meters. It was just too heavy. Eventually, Mainla left, and Nick could actually try the full throw. Since he wasn't that exhausted today, he decided to keep throwing with his ability. Nick took a couple of steps back, lifted his spear, and performed a full throw. Boom! The roof shuddered as he threw his spear into the distance. Nick watched with satisfaction as his spear traveled further and further. Ding! Suddenly, the ghost wire on his right wrist became taut, and Nick felt himself pulled forward. The force pulled him over the edge of the building, and he was about to fall toward the sewers. But even though he'd been surprised, his training with the ghost wire kicked in, and he pulled on it even more. Nick was pulled away from the big building, and landed on a smaller one farther away just as his spear reached him again. Nick thought, that went way better than I anticipated. After retrieving his spears so many times and running across the training ground so much, Nick had become extremely familiar with his environment and his spear. The way he'd pulled himself forward to land on a small building, while easily catching the spear, looked almost beautiful. Nick had barely learned to throw a spear properly, but he already looked like someone who'd used spears for years. This made Nick realize one thing. Mainla is an amazing teacher, he thought in awe. When he'd first arrived at this training ground, he'd felt unsure due to the weight of his spears and the destroyed grates and buildings everywhere. The thought of throwing his spears in such a place had made him anxious. But now it was easy. The broken ground might as well not exist, since Nick knew exactly what was below him at any moment, and he could move through the air without losing his spears. In just 4 days, Nick had become very confident with his spears. Eventually, Nick returned to the tall building and continued practicing full throws with his ability active. Sadly, he had to stop after just half an hour. The 3 hours of throwing had already exhausted his arm. But Nick still didn't leave. I think I can eat later. This training ground is too good, and I haven't properly exercised the rest of my body today. So Nick ran and jumped across the rooftops while carrying all his spears. With his ability active, this was no longer a problem. If he did his warm-up routine again, he wouldn't even need a minute, which was why he didn't. Instead, he threw his spears in the air, pulling himself from one side to the other. Nick wanted to get familiar with moving in the air. Humans generally weren't good at it, but with the throwing spears, he'd somewhat overcome the weakness. After a bit more than an hour, Nick became exhausted and returned home. I'm excited for more training in 4 days, Nick thought while eating. But first, I'm going to learn about fist weapons tomorrow. I can actually see myself becoming stronger. My goal is actually not impossible. But when Nick had that thought, his good mood vanished. For the past 4 days, he'd managed to put on a mask that had even fooled himself. A mask that said nothing was wrong. But now that he'd remembered his true face, the mask had become visible again. In the end, Nick could only take a deep breath. I can't get lost in this excitement. All of this is only a means to an end. And I can't forget that. Chapter 127, Julian. The next day, after finishing his work and getting something to eat, Nick returned to Dark Dream. He was about to meet his other teacher, the one who'd teach him about his fist weapons. When Nick came back, he saw a new person waiting for him in front of Wintour's office. Wintour was also present, and the two were talking. Nick assumed this was his new teacher, but he wouldn't have guessed it from the person's appearance. He was a very young man, at least that was how he looked. He was about 170 centimeters tall, with an extremely bright and innocent smile. His stature seemed thin and agile, almost like a sprinter's. His hair was a calm blue, and he seemed very relaxed. But unlike Mainla, this person wore the uniform of an expert from Blitz, which meant he was much more powerful than her. A level 4 Zephyx Extractor. Someone on the same level as Albert. Yet he seemed so different from Mainla. It was almost like their genders were reversed. Mainla was big, powerful, and dominant. This guy was small, refined, and gentle. After looking for a bit, Nick walked over. The man slowly turned to look at Nick with his bright blue eyes and gently waved with a heartfelt smile. "There you are, Nick," Wintour said with a slightly excited voice. Nick could tell Wintour really enjoyed talking to this guy based on his tone. "Julian, this is your new student, my chief Zephyx Extractor, Nick," Wintour said, gesturing to Nick. Julian smiled and offered his hand. "Nice to meet you, Nick. I'm Julian, and I'm going to be your trainer for fist weapons." Nick looked at the hand for a bit and decided to shake it. After meeting Mainla, he'd become unsure whether he was supposed to shake hands. As soon as Nick touched Julian's hand, his eyes widened. So hard and rough, Nick thought in shock. It was like touching the hand of a humongous metallic titan, compressed into a tiny shape. There was so much explosive power in it. Nevertheless, the handshake was gentle, and Nick felt no pain. After feeling Julian's hand, Nick actually looked at it. It was like the hand didn't belong to the man in front of him. While Julian seemed like a gentle, peaceful boy, his hand was rough and filled with aggressive, powerful veins that expanded and shrank in sync with his heartbeat. Julian noticed Nick's reaction, but he only chuckled and slowly pulled his hand back. "I get that reaction all the time," he said softly. "I take it as a compliment." "Sorry," Nick said. "I didn't expect such a strong hand." "Harmony and discord are two sides of the same coin," Julian said. "Harmony requires gentleness, and discord requires power. You can only live in harmony when people don't want discord with you, but when people want harmony, you must be gentle. Otherwise, there is no harmony, only fear. Learning this principle will help you with your position," Julian said with a smile. Nick listened intently and thought about the words. He took them seriously, since they came from an actual expert. Experts were the elite of Kugelblitz, and everyone had incredible power. "He's probably far older than he looks," Nick thought. "Becoming an expert would take me many years, maybe decades. He most likely knows what he's talking about." "Thank you, I'll remember that," Nick said. Julian nodded and turned to Wintour. "Do you have a place where we can train?" "There's a gym about 500 meters from here, but I don't think it's durable enough to withstand you," Wintour said. Julian laughed. "That's fine, I can keep myself in check." Wintour also laughed and told Julian where to find the gym. After a bit more talking, Julian and Nick walked out to go to the gym. Nick subconsciously fell into a position behind Julian. Julian just had this irresistible aura of reliability, power, and trust. He subconsciously made people want to follow him. Julian didn't look at Nick following behind him, and only shook his head a bit with a helpless smile. "Can I ask you something?" Nick asked after some hesitation. "Sure," Julian said, turning with a smile. "You're an expert, right?" Julian nodded wordlessly. "Don't take this the wrong way, but why is someone as powerful as you teaching a newbie like me?" Nick asked. "I don't think Wintour has the funds to hire someone like you." Julian laughed a bit. "Of course he does." Nick raised his eyebrows in surprise. "After all, my services aren't very expensive. In fact, I'm not getting paid at all." This surprised Nick even more. "But then why?" he asked. "I'll tell you when we're there," Julian said with a playful smirk. Nick was still confused, but he followed. After some minutes, the two reached the gym and entered. The gym was a huge hall, nearly 100 meters long. Gyms like these catered to normal people and Zephyx Extractors. After all, where was a Zephyx Extractor supposed to exercise? If a veteran accidentally kicked a wall, it would break into pieces and fly away. Of course, since this gym was in the outer city and not the inner city, it only catered to normal people and newbies. As soon as the two entered, the trainer at the counter looked at Julian like he was a Specter. The trainer immediately told Julian he was so sorry, but he couldn't offer a training room for someone this powerful. Julian assured him he wasn't the one training and wouldn't damage anything. Eventually, the trainer relented and gave them a room for free. He was using the opportunity for some publicity. Chapter 128, A Wager. The two entered the room and closed the door. This was the biggest room the gym offered, over 10 meters wide and long, with small pieces of equipment in a couple of closets at the side. Julian walked around and tested the ground. If you're careful, you can probably use almost all your power. The ground and walls were made of extremely dense, cold metal. In fact, the wall felt almost identical to the wall of the first containment unit Dark Dream had bought. Nick nodded. "Sounds good." Julian turned away from Nick and smiled. He remained silent for a while. Nick raised an eyebrow in uncertainty. "I'm not here because of Wintour," Julian said. "You're not?" Nick asked in surprise. Julian shook his head while facing away. The next moment, Nick's ability activated. It seemed like Julian could no longer perceive him. 2 seconds later, Nick's ability deactivated again. Julian hadn't moved. A second later, Nick's ability reactivated. And deactivated. And reactivated. And finally, deactivated again. Julian just chuckled and shook his head helplessly. "Wow," he said, "it's really impossible to perceive. No matter what I do, I can't see any sign of it." Nick's eyes widened, and his heart rate shot up as he realized what these words meant. "You know," Nick asked in shock. "I'm here because of Albert," Julian said, turning to face Nick with a smile. "Albert and I are close friends, and he told me about you." "Yes, that includes your ability." Nick became nervous. An extractor's ability was their deepest secret. If an enemy knew it, they could counter it, and Nick's ability was especially weak to counters. Of course, Nick also felt betrayed by Albert. How could Albert tell someone else? "Don't worry," Julian said with a chuckle. "While I'm employed by Blitz, I don't belong to them. I'm not allowed to tell you the specifics, but I won't tell your secret to anyone, even if you somehow threaten Blitz." Of course, Nick didn't completely believe him, but there was nothing he could do. Julian knew Nick's secret, and that was that. "So you're here because of my ability?" Nick asked. "Partially," Julian answered. "I'm also here because of your personality." Nick raised an eyebrow. "Albert described you as very idealistic and altruistic. While many people are idealistic, people from the Dregs tend not to be. The darkest facets of humanity are proudly on display for everyone in the Dregs to see, while the good ones hide far away. A brutal and lawless arena breeds cynical people and idealistic corpses. Idealistic survivors are rare, especially those who grew up essentially without parents in such a place." Nick had an uncertain expression. He agreed with Julian, or he would have. Sadly, things were a bit different. This whole thing with Pater and Horya made him feel like all the happiness and magic of the world had vanished. "You don't agree?" Julian asked, looking at Nick. Nick sighed. "I used to be like that, but not anymore." "How come?" Julian asked. "Some things happened," Nick said. Silence. "I presume you don't want to talk about it." Nick looked to the side. "It would take too long. Also, we're supposed to train, right?" Nick said. "Getting to know you is important to me, Nick," Julian said. "If you're fine with it, I'm willing to listen." Nick took a deep breath. He wanted to tell someone about his troubles, and Julian seemed very trustworthy. Somehow, Nick felt Julian was a person worth trusting. "Okay," Nick said. Then he told Julian about Horya and Pater and how it had changed him. "So you're idealistic but no longer naive," Julian said. Nick furrowed his brows. "I'm not sure anymore." "You want to improve the lives of others, right?" Julian said. "You want to help all the people of the Dregs, even though they've never done anything for you. I don't think many people would want to do something so selfless." Nick looked to the side with uncertainty. "I don't know," he said. By now, Nick felt deflated again. The hole in his chest had returned. He might distract himself every day, but in the end, that was what life was for him. A distraction. In the end, the suffering and guilt still consumed his insides, and feeling better on the outside didn't help. "How old are you?" Julian asked. 16, Nick answered. "Still quite young," Julian said. "How strong is your conviction? How much do you want to help others?" Nick looked at Julian calmly. "It's the only reason I'm still alive." Julian looked at him with interest. "What if you change?" "What do you mean?" Nick asked. "What if you get a lover, a high status, a child, or something similar? If all your life's wishes are handed to you, will you still hold on to this altruistic dream? When people betray you again and again, will you still try to improve the lives of humanity?" Nick didn't answer immediately as he thought. "Yes," Nick said. "I owe as much to Horya. He would have wanted me to help others." "And your sense of duty is so strong it will hold firm decades from now?" Julian asked. Nick nodded, yes. At that moment, Julian turned away from Nick, and a grin appeared on his face. "Care to bet on it?" Julian asked. Nick looked at Julian in surprise and confusion, as Julian looked away from him. "A bet?" "Yes, a bet," Julian said. Nick furrowed his brows, not quite sure where that had come from. Meanwhile, something horrific was happening. Julian's eyes vanished, and several smirking mouths filled his face. "A wager, if you will," the mouths spoke in unison, creating a layered voice that rippled through the room. Nick's eyes became unfocused. "A wager," Nick repeated in a distant, confused voice. "Yes," the many mouths answered. "Of course, a wager is boring without any stakes. Are you interested?" Nick's blank eyes looked at the back of Julian's head. "Sure, why not?" Chapter 129, He's a Great Guy. "I had a lot of fun today. Sorry for taking up your time," Julian said with a friendly smile. "No problem, you helped me a lot," Nick said with a grin. After Nick had told Julian about his issues, Julian talked with him for a couple of hours about what to do. Julian told Nick he was trying to atone for something that couldn't be atoned for. Nick was still young and hadn't been ready for such a big responsibility. Julian said Nick had to live his own life, and that Horya's fate was because Winter hadn't properly informed Nick about everything. After all, if Winter had told Nick what would happen if Horua refused to become an extractor after seeing the dreamer, Nick wouldn't have made Horua sign the contract, right? Therefore, Nick wasn't at fault. It was Winter. So why was Nick trying to atone for something that wasn't his fault? Additionally, Nick had always only lived for himself, since the people of the Dregs always shunned him. Julian said it seemed like Nick was trying to help all these people because he wanted to belong to a community. Nick was desperately trying to be part of a community, which was why he was willing to sacrifice everything to help people who only despised him. The things Julian said made a lot of sense, but Nick just couldn't accept them emotionally. Sure, maybe he was trying to help people who didn't deserve it, but his emotions told him a human should help other humans. The instinct to help others was inherent to every human. So wasn't helping others just being human? Was it wrong to be human? Julian told Nick he was free to do whatever he wanted, but that he should always consider all sides. After such a long talk, Julian also confessed something. He wasn't actually Nick's trainer. He was someone higher up in Blitz who simply wanted to meet Nick and talk to him. The actual trainer would come tomorrow. However, Nick wasn't angry at Julian. After all, he felt a bit better after talking to him. Maybe Julian was right about some things. For example, Julian had also said Nick's imagination of what Horua wanted sounded too idealistic. Would a boy truly want to save the place that would have thrown him out of his house as a last wish? It sounded more realistic that the boy would want these people to pay for all they'd done. Nick didn't like that thought, but it actually sounded possible. Of course, they talked about more, but for some reason, a huge part of the talk had become blurry. We talked about so many things that I can't even tell how much we covered or for how long. I feel like I already forgot half of it, Nick thought as he rubbed his head. After a minute, Nick managed to focus again and looked up. Julian was gone. He probably already went home, Nick thought as he walked out of the gym. As Nick walked down the streets, he kept rubbing his head. It was like all his memories and thoughts were jumbled up. In the end, he decided to ignore it and got some food. During his sleep, Nick dreamt of many gigantic mouths surrounding him and talking to him. The voices were so loud and droning, and he felt like what they were saying was something he couldn't possibly do. He tried to run from the mouths, but new ones kept appearing. For an eternity, Nick just kept running. While running, he became angrier and angrier. It was like all the people around him were telling him they hated him and wanted him to die. The mouths hurt Nick. They represented all the people of the Dregs who had ridiculed him when he was younger. Eventually, Nick woke and went to work. "Hey Nick, how was training?" Winter asked from his office. "He didn't tell you?" Nick asked. "No," Winter answered in confusion. "Julian isn't my trainer," Nick said. "He acted like he was so he could talk to me alone." "Oh, that's understandable," Winter said with a dismissive wave. "Julian is a busy man, but he's very trustworthy." "I know," Nick said. "By the way, where did you meet Julian?" "I don't know," Winter said casually. "Maybe he led me around Blitz or something." "Oh, that could be it," Nick said, accepting the answer. "Who's my actual teacher, by the way?" "Someone called Reynold," Winter answered. "He was supposed to come yesterday, but Julian said he'd told Reynold he would do your training. But since he won't now, I should probably call Reynold again. I'll get back to him and tell him he's your teacher again." Nick nodded. "Great. By the way, do you know how I can reach Julian?" "No idea," Winter said. "You don't know where he lives?" "No." "Can't you just contact him via Blitz?" "Julian doesn't work for Blitz," Winter said. "Oh," Nick said, "so I can't reach him." "I don't know where he is," Winter said, "but when we need him, I'm sure he'll pop up." "Probably," Nick said with a nod. "Anyway, I'm going to work now." "Good luck," Winter said, returning to writing on a piece of paper. Nick entered the Dreamer's containment unit, and 2 minutes later, he was asleep. As soon as Nick started to dream, all the mouths returned, telling him he should kill everyone. But just a couple of moments later, all the mouths vanished, and 2 dead owl eyes appeared in the sky of Nick's dream world. For just a moment, the dead eyes focused on the vanishing mouths. And then Nick was transported into a torture room where he was forced to torture Horua. Chapter 130, Reynold. Eventually, Nick was woken by Jenny, and he left the containment unit. When he checked the produced Zephyx, Nick realized the amount had dropped just a bit. If my suffering in the nightmare is what produces Zephyx, it means I haven't suffered as much. I'm sure the dreamer is still trying its best to squeeze as much suffering out of me, but the drop means it just can't make me suffer as much anymore. Nick released a sigh of relief and let out a tiny smile. Thank you, Julian, you really helped me. But then Nick shook his head and took a deep breath. That doesn't change anything, Nick thought. What's the point of feeling good? I'm not a slave to my emotions, and I have an actual goal I want to achieve. Suffering, happiness, both are irrelevant. Then Nick nodded with conviction and dealt with the Zephyx that was produced. Wintour said Reynolds had agreed again to train Nick, and he'd be here in an hour. Nick got some food and grabbed his weapons. He left his spears at home, which made him feel a bit naked, but he still wasn't strong enough to wear all his weapons at once. At least not while his ability wasn't active. With his ability active, carrying all his spears and fist weapons would be like a normal adult carrying about 8 to 10 kilos. It wasn't nice, but it was manageable. About 10 minutes before 3 p.m., Nick walked into Dark Dream and quickly noticed his new trainer. Nick already knew he was called Reynolds, since Wintour had mentioned his name. Reynolds was a little smaller than Mainla, but he seemed twice as wide. While Mainla was thin and tall, Reynolds was filled with explosive muscle. Even so, Nick could easily tell there was no unnecessary fat on him. Just like Mainla, Reynolds wore the uniform of a veteran of Blitz. In a way that relieved Nick. Julian had seemed too powerful for a trainer, and Nick had felt like he was wasting his time. As Reynolds talked to Wintour, his boisterous, casual, friendly voice echoed throughout Dark Dream. His voice was very deep, and he laughed a lot. Well, we'll see about that, Reynolds said to Wintour with a boisterous laugh. Nick could hear him from over 5 meters away. Oh, Nick, my boy, Reynolds shouted with an excited smile. You came at just the right time. I was just making a bet with Wintour about when you'll crack under my tough training. Wintour was smiling, but Nick could tell he was a bit uncomfortable with Reynolds' loud, dominant presence. A bet, Nick repeated as his eyes glazed over. A bet. A wager. Nick felt like he'd forgotten something important, but he quickly shook his head to regain his bearings. Getting distracted in front of his new teacher wouldn't leave a good impression. Oh, Nick said, approaching Reynolds, what do you two think? I have full trust in you, Wintour said. Nick smiled a little. Ahaha, good, good, Reynolds shouted as he loudly clapped a couple of times. True companionship and trust, I love it. But we can't just ignore the facts, Reynolds added with a smirk as he bumped Nick's shoulder with his fist. Nick didn't rub his shoulder, but he was in quite a bit of pain. Still, he could tell Reynolds genuinely didn't mean it. He was just careless and living in the moment. I'll say you won't get to the 10th day, Reynolds said with a smirk. Sorry, Nick, my boy, but that's just what I think. You're only 16, and you still need to experience a couple of setbacks to truly attain the grit to put everything into your goal. Nick raised an eyebrow. In a way, he was a bit insulted, but he could also tell Reynolds wasn't trying to put him down. He was just very confident. So you agree, 10 days of training, Wintour asked. Reynolds looked at Wintour with a smirk. Aren't you greedy? Yes, I agree. The next moment, Reynolds and Wintour shook hands. You're about to lose a lot of money and dignity, little Wintour, Reynolds shouted happily with a laugh. But there was also a smirk on Wintour's face. Nick, he said, making Nick look at him, could you please tell your new teacher about your other teacher? At that, Reynolds became quiet and looked at Wintour with a serious, evaluating gaze. Nick was taken aback by how quickly Reynolds' demeanor had changed. Just now he'd seemed like someone who went out to party all the time with the boys, but now he felt like a serious, reliable warrior. Sure enough, extractors who can get into Blitz are outstanding, Nick thought before answering. Mainla, Nick said, looking at Reynolds. Reynolds blinked a couple of times. Which one? He asked with a slightly nervous voice. What do you mean, which one? Wintour said with a confident chuckle. There's only one Mainla. Reynolds took a deep breath as he looked at Nick differently. And you managed to get through 4 days of training under Mainla? He asked. Nick nodded. Her training is amazing. I'd never have thought I'd learned so much in just 4 days. Reynolds grabbed his hair with both hands and looked up in a melodramatic pose of tragedy. And yet again, I fell victim to my own confidence, he said before taking a deep breath. Then he loudly laughed again. Well done, well done. You managed to pull one over on me, little Wintour, Reynolds said. Seems like you'll get some free training out of me. Wintour just smiled. Thank you. Reynolds chuckled and shook his head. I was sure the other teacher would be William. To think you managed to convince Mainla." Then Reynolds sighed. Chapter 131, Whirlwind. After exchanging a couple more words, Reynolds and Nick left Dark Dream. "Hey Nick, you know any good places to fight?" Reynolds asked. "There's a gym nearby," Nick said. "Hey, that's no good," Reynolds said. "If I accidentally punch too hard, I'll have to pay for their room. You know, a different place. Doesn't even have to be very sturdy, just big." Nick furrowed his brows. "I don't know of such a place," Nick said. "There are a couple of abandoned places in the Dregs, but they're filled with houses or rubble. There's nothing like a wide arena." "Abandoned places," Reynolds repeated with a smirk. "Can you show me one?" "Sure," Nick said. Then Reynolds started to laugh loudly, but he didn't tell Nick why. After a bit of walking, Nick jumped on top of one of the buildings at the edge of the Dregs and showed Reynolds the empty houses. "This place has nearly no one, since no one from the outer city wants to live here, and nobody from the Dregs dares to. That means almost all these houses are permanently empty. I'm not even sure who built them," Nick said. Reynolds grinned as he looked at the houses. "Oh, this is going to be fun," he said before jumping off the building. The ground quaked when Reynolds jumped, and the house beneath him almost broke apart. That was very different from when Mainla jumped. Nick looked on in surprise as Reynolds jumped over 100 meters without a running start. Boom! Nick's eyes widened as a cloud of dust exploded when Reynolds landed. Even more, the house he'd landed on had turned into nothing but rubble. It was almost like a meteor had fallen on it. Then Nick saw Reynolds jump out of the destroyed house. He flew almost 50 meters into the air before landing on the neighboring house. Boom! The house exploded, and the metallic rubble shot in all directions. Boom, boom, boom. Then Nick saw one piece of rubble fly away after another as Reynolds unleashed punches and kicks at crazy speeds. It was almost like Reynolds had transformed into a whirlwind of violence. In fewer than 30 seconds, Reynolds had cleared the entire area he'd landed in of rubble. He destroyed a house and cleaned it up in no time. Of course, the rubble wasn't truly cleaned up. It was now stuck in all the surrounding houses. Nick could only take a deep breath. He had often imagined the powers of a veteran, but the only demonstration he'd ever seen was Mainla throwing her spear. But this time, Nick truly saw what a veteran could do. This was no longer in the realm of what humans could do. Reynolds kicked metallic pieces, several tons heavy, into the distance like they were toys. When he was done with the second house, he went back to the first and cleaned that one too. Then Reynolds cleaned his hands with a satisfied smirk. He'd created a sizable empty space, and with the border covered in a wall of rubble, it almost looked like an actual arena. "Hey Nick, what were you waiting for?" Reynolds shouted with an excited smile. Nick scratched the back of his head before shrugging and jumping from house to house to reach Reynolds in his new arena. When Nick reached it, he noticed something. There were two sizable holes in the ground. Nick knew exactly where they'd come from and looked at Reynolds. "How come you're not dirty?" Nick asked. "You fell into the sewers, right?" Yes, the holes were where Reynolds had landed. With his force and weight, he'd shot through the house and the floor like a cannonball, and by all accounts must have landed in the sewers. Yet there wasn't a bit of water on him. Reynolds just laughed loudly. Ding, ding. Then he knocked on the air around him, and Nick saw something ripple around Reynolds. "Oh, your barrier, right," Nick said. Naturally, a veteran working for Blitz had access to amazing equipment, and their barriers were probably just as amazing. "I have to admit, though, I was spooked for a bit," Reynolds shouted with loud laughter. "When I was submerged down below, I felt the presence of the nightmare and jumped away real quick." Reynolds kept laughing like something hilarious had happened. One had to remember that, powerful as he was, Reynolds was just as helpless before the nightmare as a normal person. "What are you waiting for, Nick?" Reynolds asked with a grin. Nick was a bit confused. "This arena isn't big enough," Reynolds said. "We gotta get rid of 2 more houses." "I took care of 2, and now you take care of the other 2. Nick raised his brows in surprise as he looked at the houses surrounding him. Everyone was used to seeing houses all the time, but when one seriously considered destroying one realized how big they actually were. "Destroy a house," Nick repeated in confusion. "Yeah, go ahead, just like me," Reynolds shouted with a laugh. Nick scratched the back of his head. He could guess this was already part of his training, but he could also tell this kind of training was very different from Mainla's. Nick looked at the blades on his arms and furrowed his brows. "Oh, wait a second," Reynolds said. "Those are no good for such a task." Nick raised an eyebrow and looked at him. "Luckily, I expected you might need some weapons for our training," Reynolds said, as he took something out from behind his back. Nick saw 2 heavy brown gauntlets and 2 heavy brown greaves that included armored shoes. "Your weapons are made for killing," Reynolds said with a smirk. "These are made for violence." Chapter 132, No Thinking. Nick looked at the 4 weapons in surprise and took off his own. "Where should I put these?" Nick asked, gesturing to his silver weapons. "Just throw them in the corner somewhere," Reynolds said dismissively. This surprised Nick, no respect for the craftsmanship. Reynolds shook his head in confusion. "Wait, what?" "You know, treating weapons with respect," Nick said. "Mainla told me we're supposed to treat our weapons with respect." "Why?" Reynolds asked in genuine confusion. "They're objects, they're not alive, they don't care." Nick scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Yeah, but Mainla said a lot of work goes into creating these weapons, and that we should always treat them with respect." Reynolds snorted. "Mainla's too serious and stuck up," he said with a dismissive wave. "We paid the craftsmen, right? Therefore they belong to us, and that means we can do whatever we want with them. If we want, we can throw them into the sewers and leave. The craftsmen shouldn't care what happens to their weapons. They got their money, and that's what they wanted." Nick couldn't really argue. Logically, Reynolds was right. But Nick also thought Mainla was right. In the end, Nick just put his weapons on the roof of a building he wouldn't destroy. After that, he grabbed the weapons Reynolds had taken out. Heavy, Nick thought as soon as he lifted one greave. He estimated the greaves and gauntlets together were nearly as heavy as all his spears. Reynolds laughed loudly at how difficult it was for Nick to put them on. It was almost like this was the most hilarious thing in the world. When Nick was finally done, he stood in the middle of the arena like his feet had been glued there. Reynolds clapped with laughter. "What are you waiting for? Go," he shouted in amusement. Nick furrowed his brows and awkwardly waddled to one of the houses. It was 2 stories high and almost 10 meters long. A very average house, but to the current Nick, it seemed gigantic. He took a deep breath as he looked at the huge task in front of him. He had no idea where to start. "What are you daydreaming for? Go," Reynolds shouted. "I'm planning," Nick shouted back. "Nonsense," Reynolds shouted. "That's what others do, not us." Nick furrowed his brows and turned to him. "We are not like them," Reynolds said with an arrogant smirk. "Planning, strategizing, feinting, retreating, whatever, we don't do that. We use our fists and legs. Do you know what that means?" Nick looked at Reynolds with uncertainty before shaking his head. "It means we have more weapons than all of them," Reynolds shouted. "Everyone else has 1 or 2 weapons. Big sword for both hands, 2 swords, big clubs, small clubs, big rifle, 2 pistols, throwing spears, rapiers, whips, whatever. They all have 2 weapons at most. We have 4. As long as our enemy is within reach, they're helpless. We kick and punch and kick and punch and kick and punch and kick until there's nothing left of our enemy. We attack faster and faster until they can't defend anymore. We don't think. We punch. We kick. We unleash all our aggression and stomp their lights out. We attack so fast that not even we know what attack will launch next, and if not even we can know that, how will our enemy?" Reynolds laughed loudly. Nick wasn't usually someone who got pumped and excited, especially not lately, but the way Reynolds shouted made even his blood boil. Nick took a deep breath as his heart rate increased, and he looked at the house again. "Go," Reynolds shouted again. Nick pulled his right arm back and swung it forward with all his power. Bang! He hit the wall and created a massive dent. But the wall hadn't broken down yet. The gauntlet was just too heavy for Nick to swing properly. "I need to change my—" "Don't stop, go," Reynolds shouted, interrupting Nick's thoughts. Nick shook his head, gritted his teeth, and unleashed a kick. Bang! The wall bent more until it caved in. "Do it," Reynolds shouted with aggression. "Fucking do it, fuck this house. Destroy it." Nick gritted his teeth and punched again. "Fuck it up, this asshole insulted your mother, kill it," Reynolds shouted. Nick snorted. Reynolds sure was a character. "Fuck it up. Kill the fucker." Even though Nick found the shouts a bit embarrassing and funny, he couldn't deny they worked. Reynolds actually got his blood pumping. Nick kept kicking and punching the house. Things went very well for a couple of minutes, But then he started to tire. It was so exhausting to punch and kick without breaks in such heavy gauntlets and greaves. Me and all my homies hate this house. Destroy it, Reynolds shouted. But the shouts kept motivating Nick to continue. Rumble. Eventually, part of the second floor started to collapse. Nick wanted to jump back, but he felt something kick him into the house. It's fighting back, fuck it up, Reynolds shouted while kicking Nick into the house. Nick became a bit panicked as the ceiling above him started to collapse. In his desperation, he performed a powerful punch that bent the heavy metal plate falling on him. Nick felt his entire body shake from the impact. But it had worked. The plate now fell on the ground beside him instead of on him. Yet that wasn't the end. More of the ceiling began to collapse. Fuck him up, Reynolds shouted like a violent beast. Nick clenched his fists and started to punch the ceiling again. Bang, bang, bang. Chapter 133, Two Methods. All right, that's about enough, Reynolds said, pulling Nick back by his shoulders. Nick's breathing had become extremely labored, but his eyes glared at the house with pure hatred and aggression. After a couple of seconds, Nick's body sagged, and his breathing deepened. There we go, Reynolds said with a smirk as he let go, and Nick fell onto his knees in exhaustion. You did good, Nick, Reynolds said with a laugh. You really fucked that house up. Nick slowly turned to look at it. It was half collapsed. The front had completely fallen, but the back was still at its original height. Nick had punched the house for half an hour, and this was the result. It had been extremely exhausting, but he'd gotten quite far. How's it feel? Reynolds asked, squatting beside Nick. Nick thought about it as he looked at the house. Good, he said. Reynolds laughed loudly. That's the way we like it, he shouted as he slapped Nick's back, making him cough. Nick, Reynolds said, quiet for his standards, we are not thinkers. We are not planners. Our power doesn't come from here, Reynolds said, pointing at his head. It comes from here, he said, hitting his chest with his fist. Our brains might make us move smarter, but our feelings make us move faster. Someone who needs to get home to protect their family from a threat will run much faster than normal. Someone filled with hatred and anger will attack much faster and harder than normal. Our weapons are the fastest, and the best way to take advantage of that is to make them even faster. Punch faster and faster until nobody can defend anymore. So what if an enemy sees our attack and blocks it? We just keep punching and kicking, and eventually their foresight won't help anymore. What good is their intelligence and perception when their bodies can't move fast enough to defend? Reynolds shouted with a loud laugh. Nick listened intently. What Reynolds was teaching was very different from Mainla. Mainla was methodical in planning, while Reynolds went all out. One was the epitome of control, the other the epitome of chaos. Break's over, Reynolds said with a smirk before shoving Nick forward. Come on, fuck him up. Nick took a deep breath and cracked his neck. Then he ran violently into the building. He threw all caution to the wind and decided to just go crazy, doing whatever his body told him. Come on, do it, fucking do it, just do it, Reynolds kept shouting. The house kept shaking under the impacts, and debris fell as Nick demolished its insides. 20 minutes later, Reynolds pulled Nick out again. Nick nearly puked from exhaustion. Mainla's training was also extremely exhausting, but that exhaustion was different. At the end of Mainla's training, Nick felt like his body had been abused to its fullest, and it hurt everywhere. But here, Nick felt like he was about to lose consciousness and die. With Mainla, it felt like he'd exhausted his body. With Reynolds, it felt like he'd exhausted his energy. Another difference was that Mainla never gave Nick breaks, while Reynolds forced him to take them several times. Look at that beauty, Reynolds said with a smirk as he looked at the house. Nick also looked. It had turned into rubble. Just a small hill of broken metal. That was me, Nick thought. I did this. Nick still remembered how big and intimidating the house had been. It had been a huge structure of metal. Now it was manageable pieces of rubble. Next, you gotta kick and punch the pieces so hard they stick in the edge of the arena, Reynolds said, pointing at the edges. When Reynolds had destroyed the first two houses, he'd kicked the rubble aside with so much power that it got stuck in the surrounding houses, creating a makeshift wall. Nick realized this would be very different from what he'd done so far. Destroying the house had required continued explosions of power, but burying these pieces required short bursts. Come on, get to it, Reynolds shouted as he shoved Nick forward. Nick took a deep breath and charged at the rubble. He immediately kicked one of the pieces with all his power. Bang! Sadly, the plate hit the building flat and slid down. Nick wanted to go retrieve it. "Forget it," Reynolds shouted. "You're thinking too much. You only have to bury them in the houses. You don't have to throw from a distance. Just keep punching and kicking the hill of rubble until it's gone, and when some pieces are still at the edge of the arena, just stomp them into the buildings like they're a shitty stamp. Come on, faster, stronger." Nick had already continued attacking the hill, and soon many pieces of debris were flying everywhere. Some landed in the arena. Some hit a building and slid down. Some got buried in a building. Nick just kept punching and attacking the rubble. This time there were no breaks. His breaks were between kicking the debris. After all, he was now attacking many small pieces instead of one big one. That required many small explosions of power instead of one big one. "Faster, faster, faster," Reynolds shouted. "Fucking do it. Fuck it up. Kick the fucker." Under Reynolds' constant shouts of motivation, Nick kept going at the hill of debris. He didn't even notice the time passing. Chapter 134, Men and Women. "And that's it," Reynolds shouted with laughter when he saw Nick punch the last piece of debris into a house wall. Since Nick hadn't managed to make the majority stick to the walls, he just punched and kicked the debris into them from melee range. As soon as he was done, Nick fell onto his back. He didn't lose consciousness, but he felt like he couldn't stay on his feet. His entire body was burning and aching, and the heavy weapons felt like they'd fused to him. For over 3 minutes, Nick couldn't be bothered to think about anything. He was too busy trying to survive and breathe. When Reynolds saw Nick's eyes regain focus, he walked over and squatted down beside him, smirking. "Tough, isn't it?" Reynolds asked. Nick was so busy breathing heavily that he only nodded several seconds later. "Training as a Zephyx Extractor is different from training as a normal person, Nick," Reynolds said with a chuckle. "The more Zephyx we have, the quicker our regeneration. As a peak newbie, you should recover from something like this within 24 hours, which is just perfect for our training tomorrow." Nick breathed heavily. "Is training like this very important?" he asked through gasps. Reynolds nodded. "Yep, Zephyx is our source of energy, and it also increases the power of our bodies. But the increase is based on our fitness. For example, Mainla is very fit and quite big, but her physical power can't compare to mine. Even though the inherent strength difference between the sexes becomes less important the stronger we get, since the average density of female muscle rises to almost the same as male muscle, men still tend to train their bodies with more fervor on average. There are exceptions, but on average, that's still the case." Nick furrowed his brows. "Are you sure?" he asked, slowly sitting up. "This doesn't seem like Mainla. Maybe she just prioritizes flexibility and speed over pure strength due to her weapon." Reynolds laughed and shook his head. "That's an excuse and doesn't represent the truth. While an excessive amount of muscle can slow you down, that amount must truly be excessive." Reynolds lifted his right arm and flexed it, showing his bulky muscles. The next moment, he relaxed it and moved it over his shoulder. His other arm also moved behind his back, but from below. After he turned around, Nick saw what he was doing. Right now, Reynolds' 2 hands were holding each other behind his back, one coming from above and one from below. Almost all humans could do that, but for someone as muscular as Reynolds, it was special. Then Reynolds did the splits, eliciting a shocked expression from Nick. "Lastly, our weight barely increases as we grow more powerful," Reynolds said, as he almost seemed to teleport into the distance. "Even though I obviously weigh more than Mainla, it's at the absolute most 100 kilos, and that's being extremely generous." Reynolds grinned. "And what's 100 kilos for a veteran?" Nick couldn't find a counter-argument. "But then, why doesn't she train like that?" Reynolds laughed loudly. "Because she doesn't want to look like me," he shouted. Nick just looked at Reynolds for a while. "That's it. That was the entire reason." "It's understandable, though," Reynolds added. "There are a couple of female extractors in Blitz with bodies very similar to mine, and damn, they're scary. If you saw them, you'd immediately think they were men, but the fact that they're women makes it so much scarier. Not in a negative sense. It's just that being willing to sacrifice your outward appearance for power to this degree shows a terrifying amount of dedication and willpower. They're like iron soldiers, and you can tell their fanatic dedication to becoming stronger just from their eyes. I mean, I want to become stronger too, but damn, I can't compare to them. Reynolds laughed some more. I still want to live a little, you know. Nick furrowed his brows. It sounded believable, but he still wanted to ask Mainla in a couple of days. Anyway, enough talking, Reynolds said. We're over. Over, Nick asked. We've been here for 3.5 hours, Reynolds said. Oh, Nick answered, sorry. Nah, it's fine, Reynolds said with a dismissive wave. We're just going to rectify that tomorrow. Tomorrow, you deal with the second house in 2.5 hours. With your experience from today, this should be doable. Nick took a deep breath. Sure, he'd definitely be faster tomorrow, but nearly an entire hour faster. That would be brutal. Just as brutal as today. Not surprising that you thought I'd only hold out for 10 days, Nick said with a sigh. Reynolds laughed loudly. We're going to turn you into a bronze titan, Reynolds shouted as he slapped Nick's back. You still have a bit of growing ahead of you, and if you eat enough while training hard, you should be able to squeeze a couple more centimeters out of your body. Nick hadn't really thought about it before, but now he realized he'd enjoy being taller. Thank you, Reynolds, Nick said as he stood. You taught me a lot today. No problem, boy, Reynolds shouted with a loud laugh. I'm going to make a man out of you. Nick also laughed and nodded. Anyway, gotta go. Work calls, Reynolds said with a wave before jumping into the distance. See you tomorrow, Nick shouted after him. For a bit, Nick just watched Reynolds jumping away. He was very impressed by him. He was outstanding in basically every department. If the thing with Horyo and Pater hadn't happened, maybe I'd have become someone like this in the future, Nick thought. But now, he could only sigh. Chapter 135, Playing. Nick felt like his body was falling apart when he came home after eating 2 chickens. The exhaustion was so deep. As soon as he fell into bed, he almost immediately fell asleep. Since he fell asleep early, he also woke early. After waking, Nick still felt aches in his body, but they were far duller than yesterday. Since he woke so early, he decided to practice his punches and kicks without his weapons. Without the heavy weapons, and with his ability active, all the movements felt very different. It was almost like his legs and arms shot forward on their own. Sadly, Nick had to change locations quickly when he heard creaking noises from the floor of his room. While he wasn't hitting anything, the force he applied to the ground while punching was still significant. Wait, didn't I build a place just for that yesterday? Nick thought. After checking the clock, he realized he still had 3 hours before he had to get breakfast and go to work. So Nick jumped toward the newly built arena. Since he hadn't taken any weapons, he moved insanely fast. But he also felt a bit naked. After walking around with his weapons every day, not carrying some felt strange. For the next 3 hours, Nick practiced punches and kicks on one of the surrounding houses, making sure not to touch the house he was supposed to tear down this afternoon. Since his power was now much stronger with his ability active, he did more damage than yesterday, but surprisingly, not that much more. Weapons really make a difference, Nick thought. I'm 5 times stronger than yesterday, but only twice as fast at destroying stuff. Nevertheless, Nick kept attacking the house as he tried different ways of punching. While Mainla always explained in detail how Nick was supposed to do something, Reynolds didn't. Instead, Reynolds let Nick figure things out on his own. Maybe that's all I need, Nick thought. I mean, at some point if I punch enough times, my punches will become very strong and fast. I guess it's less theory and more practice. Because of that, Nick decided not to think much about how he was moving and just kept moving, though he stayed careful not to overexert himself before his afternoon training. This was only practice, not actual training. Eventually, Nick got something to eat and entered dark dream. Good morning, Nick, Winter said from his office. Morning, Nick answered with a nod. How's Reynolds' training? Winter asked with a smirk. Exhausting, Nick immediately answered, but also very good. I presume you can deal with it, Winter asked. Nick nodded. I like his training. I wouldn't want to quit even if you wanted me to. Good to hear, Winter said. After that, Nick worked with the Dreamer and dealt with all his duties, and before he knew it, it was time for his training with Reynolds. When Nick arrived at the arena, Reynolds was already waiting. Ready for a new day in hell? Reynolds asked with a loud laugh. Yes, Nick shouted. Good, good, Reynolds shouted as he threw Nick the 4 weapons from yesterday. Nick quickly switched into them and nodded at Reynolds with conviction. You ready? Reynolds asked. Nick nodded. Good, Reynolds said. Then Reynolds grabbed Nick, lifted him overhead, and threw him at the house he was supposed to tear down like a cannonball. Then get to it, Reynolds shouted with some aggression. Boom, boom. Nick shot through the house and came out the other side. Right now, Nick's blood was already pumping, but not for the same reason as yesterday. What the fuck was the only thing Nick could think. He felt like his body was hurting all over, and he wasn't even sure if he'd broken something. Did I just fly through the entire house? Nick thought. But his thoughts were cut short when he hit the house behind that one, which stopped his flight. For a while, Nick just remained in the position he'd landed in. Did that guy just throw me through a fucking house? Nick thought. Nick looked at the hole he'd left behind. He could see Reynolds through it, smirking victoriously. Come on, we don't have all day, Reynolds shouted. Nick shook his head a bit. At that moment, Nick felt a hand on his shoulder. Reynolds had already arrived beside him. Too slow, we gotta hurry. We only got 2.5 hours today, Reynolds said quickly as he began to lift Nick again. Hey, 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 Nick shouted rapidly as he flailed. Here we go. Reynolds pulled Nick back with one hand. I bet I can also throw spears. Then he threw Nick at the house like a spear. Bang, bang, bang. Nick shot through the entire thing. This time, he'd positioned his fists to point at the building while protecting his head. Nick felt his bones shake, but it didn't hurt nearly as much as the first throw. On top of that, he somewhat changed his alignment and managed to land on his feet and knees, sliding for a couple of meters. Luckily, the uniform of a Zephyx Extractor was extremely durable, and the skin and flesh on Nick's knees didn't get ground off. Nick's breathing had already quickened as his fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. This was actually dangerous. No time for thinking, Reynolds said as he grabbed Nick again. What are you doing? Nick shouted in a mix of fear and anger. Reynolds smiled brightly. Playing. Chapter 136, Recovery. For the next hour, Reynolds kept grabbing Nick and throwing him through the house. Naturally, the house collapsed quickly, but that didn't stop Reynolds. Instead of throwing Nick through it, Reynolds simply threw him into the pile until he got stuck. Nick kept asking what Reynolds was doing, and Reynolds kept answering with short replies like it was obvious. Playing. Having fun. Aren't you supposed to train me? Nick asked once before being thrown again. In response, Reynolds just laughed loudly. Am I not? No, Nick said when Reynolds pulled him out of the pile like a vegetable. We also gotta learn to defend, my boy, Reynolds shouted as he buried Nick in the debris again. Before you jump, you gotta learn how to fall, Reynolds said as he pulled Nick out. Today, I'm the one having fun, Reynolds shouted with loud laughter. For once, he didn't immediately throw Nick into the pile again. You just have to learn to defend from what's coming. Nick gulped. After that, Reynolds changed his grip and held one of Nick's ankles with his right arm. Woo-yeah, Nick shouted as Reynolds swung him around like a towel. Here goes, Reynolds shouted with a mad grin. Bang! Then he used Nick like a stick and hit the pile with him. A big part of the metallic debris exploded and scattered. At the same time, some blood splashed around. Nick had protected his head with his forearms, but they received several cuts. That's no good, Reynolds shouted when he saw the blood. You gotta use your weapons to defend, not your naked body. Before Nick could think about how he was supposed to do that, Reynolds hit him into the pile again. More blood. Come on, Reynolds shouted. Bang. You gotta learn how to defend. Bang. Several bruises had appeared on Nick's arms by now, and he was in a lot of pain. But Nick could deal with it. In the sewers, the nightmare had put him through much, much worse. And the more often Reynolds swung him, the easier it became to defend. The way Reynolds swung was almost identical every time, and Nick had learned how to protect himself. Good, Reynolds shouted with a laugh when he saw Nick's injuries stop increasing. So Reynolds turned Nick and grabbed one of his wrists instead. Bang! Nick's flat body hit the pile. At that moment, Nick's mind stopped working. The hit had been so strong that he felt unable to breathe. It was like all his organs tried to curl up. No time to relax, Reynolds shouted as he lifted Nick again. At this point, Nick just wanted out. The earlier hits were bad, but they just hurt. These ones felt genuinely dangerous. Nick grabbed Reynolds' hand and tried to pull his own out. Crack. Fuck, okay, Nick shouted as he let go of Reynolds. Just now, Reynolds had strengthened his grip, and Nick felt like his wrist was about to break in two. "This is training, Nick. You can't run from training," Reynolds said with a smirk. Bang! Reynolds hit Nick into the pile again. This time, Nick managed to protect his torso by pulling his knees to his chest. His shins hurt a lot, but it was better than last time. Over the next couple of times, Nick got better and better until he even managed to land on his feet. "Good job," Reynolds shouted with a grin. "Next." Reynolds grabbed Nick at a seemingly random spot, jumped away from the pile, and threw him without any control. Nick's body spun uncontrollably through the air, and he hit the pile with his ass first. Once more, Nick started to receive injuries. Reynolds grabbed him at a different random spot and carelessly flung him at the pile again. Nick spun uncontrollably again. This happened several more times. But slowly, Nick learned to adapt. He managed to somewhat control how his body rotated in the air and to tell where he was. Nick started to hit the pile with his arms and legs more and more. Until one moment. Bang! Nick hit the pile with the soles of his feet and stopped his momentum by kneeling. Naturally, the force still pushed him and the pile quite a bit, but Nick had essentially stabilized his position. By this moment, Nick was very injured. Blood was coming from all over his body, and if he hadn't known about his increased recovery rate, he'd already have tried to stop out of fear. The pain was bad, but Nick's adrenaline did a great job suppressing it. "Well done," Reynolds shouted before grabbing Nick again. Then he just threw Nick in a random direction. He wasn't even aiming for the pile anymore. This time, Nick had to learn to land on flat ground and vertical walls, but with his previous experience, he quickly got used to it. After that, Reynolds also randomly changed the angle he threw Nick at. Sometimes Nick flew almost perfectly straight up, and other times he skidded across the floor like a pebble skipping across a river. Nick got better and better. Finally, Reynolds wasn't even throwing Nick anymore. Now he was lightly punching and kicking him. These punches and kicks weren't designed to injure, but to throw and push. Bang! 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 In no time, Nick started to recover very quickly after every punch and kick, and he even managed to see Reynolds coming before he actually grabbed him. At that moment, Nick realized how much he'd learned today. He was able to recover from such powerful punches and kicks so quickly. That was incredible. Chapter 137, First Week. "Ha ha ha, good, good," Reynolds shouted with laughter as he clapped loudly. By now, Nick had stopped bleeding. Sure, there were plenty of dried clots all over his body, but he was no longer actively bleeding. "That should about do it," Reynolds shouted as he slowly approached Nick. Nick felt nervous as Reynolds approached, but he kept telling himself the training was over. After all, why else would Reynolds slowly walk toward him like this? Still, after being thrown around for who knew how long, Nick felt nervous. Since he now had time to calm down, Nick looked around the arena. Sure enough, all the debris had been thrown into the border. The entire house had been destroyed and cleaned up. To think Reynolds did all of this by swinging me around, Nick thought. It was so bizarre. Nick had once thought about destroying a house, but he'd never thought about being the tool that destroyed one. "Reynolds, you taught me so much today," Nick said with a sigh as he realized how stark the difference was between the start of today's training and now. At the start, Nick got injured by everything, but now he felt comfortable being thrown around in any imaginable way. If he fought someone more powerful, Nick would at least be able to recover from a powerful attack and keep running. If Nick were attacked by someone much stronger, it would be over as soon as the enemy threw him to the ground. But with this training, such a throw might even become an opportunity. After all, not everyone would expect Nick to suddenly flip in the air, which might make them misjudge his trajectory and crash against a building. That was an extremely important skill to have. "It's what I do," Reynolds shouted with a loud laugh. Then he turned to the arena and grandly gestured at it. "Also, our arena is finally done. Next week we can truly start training." "Next week? Oh right," Nick said, realizing they only had 2 days of training this week. Mainla had 4 days and Reynolds had 3, but this week he only had 2 since Julian had taken one. This meant Nick would only see Reynolds again in 5 days, since he'd spend the next 4 with Mainla. "How late is it?" Nick asked. Reynolds looked at something on his wrist. When Nick had first seen this thing, he'd been awestruck. A clock for a wrist. He hadn't even known that was possible. "We're about done. We cleaned the house in 2.5 hours," Reynolds said with a grin. You threw me around for 2.5 hours, Nick asked. Reynolds just laughed loudly. How else are you going to learn? Not everyone gets the opportunity to be flung around like this for hours on end. Nick couldn't disagree. Anyway, I'm looking forward to our 3 days next week, Reynolds said. Nick nodded, thanks again. No problem, my boy, Reynolds said as he slapped Nick's shoulder again. The two gave their farewells and split up. Nick went to buy some food, and for the evening he decided to get reacquainted with his spears in the training area Mainla had shown him. Nick's first week of training with his weapons was officially over, and he'd learned a lot. The next day, he met Mainla at the training ground again. After spending 2 days with Reynolds, Mainla didn't seem as big as before. Mainla nodded when she saw Nick. Get warmed up, you know how, she ordered. Nick nodded, jumped down the building, and used his spears to reach the 5 spots. It took him just 7 minutes while carrying all 5. When he arrived back on top, Mainla looked at him with a raised eyebrow. You move differently, she commented. I do, Nick repeated in surprise. How was he moving differently? It's like you're no longer afraid of stumbling or falling over, Mainla explained. Oh yeah, Nick said with a nod. My other teacher taught me yesterday. Yesterday? Mainla asked with furrowed brows. I don't think that's something that can be taught in a single day. Who's your teacher? He's also a veteran from Blitz, Nick said. Mainla didn't react. It's a pretty big guy called Reynolds. He's teaching me how to fight with my fist weapons, Nick said. A light appeared in Mainla's eyes. Reynolds, the loud one. Yes, the loud one, Nick answered with a chuckle. Mainla nodded. How did he teach you? She asked, the suspicion in her voice replaced by curiosity. Nick scratched the back of his head. Reynolds destroyed a house by throwing and swinging me. Mainla furrowed her brows in confusion and skepticism. What did Nick mean? Nick explained in more detail, and eventually Mainla could only accept that this was truly how Reynolds had trained him. Although the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. In a way, it was like Nick was fighting for his life against someone far more powerful for over 2 hours. After being thrown around that many times, even an idiot would learn to avoid getting injured. It's good that Reynolds is teaching you, Mainla said. He's one of the vice team leaders for us veterans, you know that. Nick blinked in surprise. No, I don't. Well, Mainla said, we have around 40 veterans in Blitz, split into 4 teams with 10 members each. One of the 10 in each team is a team leader, and every team leader has 2 vice team leaders. So, to break it down, there's 1 team leader, 2 vice team leaders, and 7 normal veterans in every team of veterans in Blitz. And Reynolds is one of them. This means Reynolds is outstanding even by the standards of Blitz, Nick thought. What about you? Nick asked. Chapter 138, A Job. I'm just a normal member, Mainla said. Oh, Nick answered. Is that surprising to you? She asked. Oh no, sorry if it came across like I was disappointed, Nick said hastily. It didn't, Mainla added emotionlessly. I was simply asking a question. Oh okay, Nick said. He didn't say anything for 3 seconds. Well, I was a bit surprised, Nick said. You seem like someone who knows how to take charge of a situation. Mainla glanced at Nick. I can see how I give off that impression. In fact, I used to be a team leader in Ghosty's lab before I switched to Blitz. You were in Ghosty's lab before? Nick asked in surprise. Mainla nodded. Over half the staff come from other manufacturers. Blitz rarely hires newbies and Johns, since everyone else wants to join us anyway. Nick nodded. That makes sense. Mainla didn't answer. Hey Mainla, Nick asked. Mainla looked at him. Do you want to be a team leader again? Mainla snorted, no. This surprised Nick. Why not? It's not as great as it seems, she said. In a big corporation, power and hierarchy work very differently. You can probably just tell Winter you want an extractor removed, and they get fired. That's not how it works in big corporations. If an extractor makes trouble, I have to file several complaints with upper management, who then tell me to handle it. When I show it hasn't improved, they'll talk a bit with the extractor, which might make things even worse, since the extractor will now hate me even more. After several rounds of this, I can finally get rid of the person who's made trouble in my team for so long. The power from both sides looks very different. Employees believe their superior is completely in control at all times, and that they can't resist. Meanwhile, the superior almost feels like the employee is in control. If an employee is rude to me, All I can do is reprimand them. And if that doesn't work, I need to put in a lot of effort to convince upper management to reprimand them. But if I'm rude to an employee, upper management will immediately pull me out and tear into me and say, I can't possibly talk like that to my team, even if they were rude first. And whenever I give an order, there's really nothing I can do if they just say no. What if they say no? If I give the order again, they'll just say no again. I can't attack them or force them. In the end, I have to talk to my superior and get them to do something, which might take days or weeks, and on top of that, they'll believe I'm the incompetent one because I can't control my team. Nick listened to Mainla's rant in stunned silence. Being a team leader is filled with stress and annoyance, which is why I'm not interested in the position anymore, Mainla said. What about becoming an expert? Nick asked. Wouldn't becoming a team leader give you some advantage? Who says I want to be an expert? Mainla asked. Now this took Nick by surprise. You don't. I'm already in enough danger working with the adult Specters. I finally managed to work with them without being in too much danger, and I'm not about to go through the same thing again with elders. Is it that bad? Nick asked. Nick, Mainla said, what is a Zephyx Extractor? Nick blinked. I'm not sure, he said. It's not a philosophical question, Mainla said. It's a job, she added. A Zephyx Extractor is a job. Why do you do a job? She asked. Money, Nick answered with a question. Correct, money, Mainla said, evenly looking at Nick. If none of us were getting paid, almost nobody would show up to work. That's the undeniable truth. We work so we can live. We don't live so we can work, Mainla said. I'm earning more than enough. I'm strong enough. I'm secure enough. I have enough free time. Why would I sacrifice all my security and free time for more money and strength? My goal is not to become the strongest person in the world. My goal is to lead a happy life. Work is work, life is life. That's it, Mainla explained. Nick understood what she was saying, but in a way it felt strange. Yes, being a Zephyx Extractor was a job, but it also let someone unlock incredible powers. Wasn't Mainla interested in being able to do things she could only dream of right now? Didn't she want to become stronger? Nick also remembered what Reynolds had said about Mainla. He'd said she wasn't interested in training as much as him due to her appearance. Back then Nick hadn't fully believed him, but now he did. Right? If Mainla only viewed this as a job, why would she sacrifice her appearance for it? Nick knew this was her choice and her opinion, but it just felt so strange to him. You don't want to become more powerful? He asked. Of course I do, Mainla answered, but in this world power comes with responsibility and work. The experts dedicate their entire lives to work, and half of them don't even have a partner. That's not a life I want to live. While I'm interested in becoming more powerful, I'm not willing to put in the time and work required. Becoming stronger just isn't as attractive as it used to be. Mainla looked at the horizon. Many people dream of becoming the most powerful in this world. But being the most powerful probably also means being the busiest. And that's not appealing to me. Chapter 139, 3 months. After talking a bit more, Mainla said they'd wasted enough time and would start training immediately. For the next 4 days, Mainla kept instructing Nick on how to throw his spears while constantly refreshing the basics he'd already learned. After that, Nick had 3 days of training with Reynolds. During these 3 days, Reynolds kept charging at Nick, trying to hit him. Reynolds wanted Nick to get used to making quick, correct decisions in a stressful, hectic situation. Since Nick used fist weapons, he needed to be the fastest person in a close combat fight, which also meant making the quickest decisions. In essence, Reynolds was shoving all kinds of movements into Nick's subconscious. The more familiar movements became, the quicker they could be performed. Sadly, something like this would take a long time. Then it was time for Nick's training with Mainla again. Back and forth. Back and forth. While Nick trained with his weapons, Jenny and Trevor also trained in theirs. Jenny had found a good teacher for her long-distance rifle in an experienced guard team working for Gemini. While the guard team didn't have a single Zephyx Extractor, their tactics, teamwork, and mastery over weapons made them dangerous even to veterans. Jenny's teacher was the sniper of this team, and he wielded an incredibly expensive rifle that could be loaded with Zephyx-based ammunition and even used Zephyx as a power source. The rifle cost over 3 million credits, and it was the only thing that let the guard team threaten a veteran. Firing it cost over 50,000 credits per shot, and without the appropriate fortifications, the recoil would break several of the sniper's bones. So even though he wasn't a Zephyx Extractor, the gunner was still extremely experienced and more than good enough to teach Jenny. Meanwhile, Trevor found a sort of club for convertible spear users. Trevor had a spear with a retractable shaft, which meant it could also be used as a dagger. Such a weapon was officially called a convertible spear. Only very few people used them, which was why this club was formed. It included over half of everyone who used this kind of weapon, and the strongest person in it was an expert. The expert instructed the two veterans, and the two veterans instructed all the Johns. Any newbies were instructed by different Johns. Membership was rather cheap, but it came with the duty to instruct one's juniors. Nevertheless, Trevor was also making amazing strides in learning to wield his weapon. The members of Dark Dream were becoming more powerful. As several weeks passed, the three Extractors also began to change. Jenny and Trevor had already become peak newbies, just like Nick. Since Jenny's training was mostly focused on stealth, running, aiming, and shooting, she became a bit more muscular but not very noticeably. Although many men on the streets kept turning their heads when she passed. Jenny had also cut off the bangs that went down the right side of her head. These bangs had often gotten in her way while she tried to look through her rifle's sight. In the end, she removed the bangs on her right while keeping the ones on her left, giving her an asymmetrical but striking appearance. Meanwhile, Trevor was becoming more muscular, but also not by much. Trevor had already been quite fit before joining Dark Dream. On top of that, he actively avoided becoming too muscular. After all, he was supposed to be Wintour's undercover agent, which meant he had to fit in with strangers. He had to be charming and handsome, not intimidating. But the biggest change was Nick. Reynolds was going hard on him. Every week, Reynolds got another brilliant idea, and Nick left every day with either heavy injuries or an absolutely exhausted body. Sometimes both. But the hard work was showing results. Since Nick could train to death every single day due to his recovery, the growth of his muscles was unparalleled. While Nick had always been quite fit, he'd never looked like an actual warrior. But now he did. Nick wasn't as muscular as Reynolds, but he was getting there. When he flexed one of his arms, one could already see all the different muscles in quite a bit of detail. Additionally, Nick's back and legs had become much bigger from carrying his extremely heavy weapons every single day. Another good thing was that Nick was growing, which improved his power even more. About 6 months had passed since the founding of Dark Dream, and Nick had grown by about 5 centimeters, putting him at 178 centimeters. From the looks of it, Nick was having a growth spurt, and it was probably also his last. So he did his best and kept training and eating a lot to extend it. Reaching a height of 190 centimeters was impossible, but 185 should still be possible. After 3 months of training, Jenny, Trevor, and Nick became very confident in their power. One night, Dark Dream held a secret meeting, and Wintour told Trevor and Jenny about the spy watching Dark Dream every few nights. Then Wintour told them his plan. The next time the spy showed up, Nick would kill him, which would provoke Cycle Artem's company. That meant working would become many times more dangerous, and every employee would become a target. While it was illegal to kill a Zephyx Extractor, nobody really investigated these things unless they happened in the middle of the day in the middle of the street. Surprisingly, Jenny and Trevor had no complaints. Dark Dream had taken them out of the Dregs, and they were willing to do anything for it. Chapter 140, Waiting. For the next couple of days, Nick went asleep directly after training and got up deep in the night. Then, for the first couple of hours after waking, Nick waited on top of a neighboring building, watching Dark Dream's warehouse. It was finally time. Wars and conflicts between manufacturers could happen for any reason. Sometimes it was as major as an assassination, and other times it was simply because one extractor looked at another with shifty eyes. But most of the time, it was small things that spiraled out of control. In a certain way, there was no enmity between Cycle and Dark Dream. Both were just working on their Specters. It was just that Artem had acted like an asshole toward Wintour, but to be fair, Wintour acted like an asshole back. And then came the entire spy business. Under normal circumstances, something like this would be easily resolved by confronting the other manufacturer and demanding payment. The other manufacturer would apologize deeply, say it was an order given by a rogue manager, and pull all members back. Of course, that was a lie, but it didn't matter. In the political game, only the surface counted. As long as there was no concrete proof, the public wouldn't be happy seeing one manufacturer attack another. Additionally, when it came to big manufacturers with over 100 employees, it was important that everyone perceived themselves to be fighting a defensive war. The other company was the one antagonizing and attacking them. They were just defending themselves. But if a manufacturer ordered their extractors to attack someone they perceived to be innocent, things could become very troublesome. One had to remember that these were companies, not countries. These were employees, not soldiers. If a manufacturer acted like a tyrant that attacked any other manufacturer just for existing, many of its extractors would quit and join another. Because of that, it was important to show proof that going against another manufacturer was justified. In a way, this also applied to Dark Dream. If Wintour just randomly ordered Jenny to assassinate the wife of some extractor, things would become very troublesome. Maybe Jenny would even run to the wife and tell her everything. After that, the other company would take her in. Wintour would demand they hand her over while denying everything, but they'd keep protecting Jenny and make her one of their employees. Giving assassination orders was always very risky, without a very compelling reason. Luckily, Dark Dream had their reason. All three extractors had seen how much of an asshole Artem was, which was already more than enough. Then that entire thing with Pater appeared, and now there was even another spy. Wintour didn't need to fear his employees abandoning ship. They were all unified against Cycle. But what about Cycle? They had 6 newbies and 2 Johns, including Artem, and only Artem had ever come into direct contact with Dark Dream. Their spy had also seen Dark Dream, but they hadn't come into contact. The remaining 6 employees had never seen anyone from Dark Dream. What if a war suddenly broke out between the 2 manufacturers? Well, without a good reason, Artem's employees wouldn't feel great risking their lives fighting some random people they'd never heard of. This meant Artem would need time to prepare a good lie to get his people to follow him into war. If he didn't have one, some of his employees might transfer to Dark Dream. From what Wintour said, Artem probably doesn't expect his spy to die, Nick thought as he watched the ceiling of Dark Dream from a neighboring house. Artem is too arrogant and thinks he has everything under control. But Nick was still a bit skeptical. While Wintour was extremely intelligent, he could also be wrong sometimes. What if Artem just acted like a dumbass to fool Wintour into lowering his guard? For now, it doesn't matter. Wintour is the CEO and I just have to trust him. I just have to wait for the spy to appear. The spy had been coming fewer and fewer times. They were probably cautious due to the guards Wintour had hired. I wonder what they're even looking for, Nick thought. I don't see what Artem would gain from looking into our warehouse after so long. I get it in the beginning since he probably just wanted to know what it looked like, but what's the point of keeping watch? He's seen everything already, Nick thought as he scratched the back of his head. Is there a different reason for sending the spy? What if they're actually not a spy? I mean, I've never seen them. I just feel their presence from time to time. Nick kept thinking about that for a while, but in the end, he just shrugged. It's Wintour's problem, not mine. I just need to deal with the spy. A couple hours passed. Nick was extremely bored. Oh, Nick thought as his body stiffened. Nick just saw something white silently landing on the roof of Dark Dream. It was shortly before 5 a.m., which was when the guard's shift changed. One could say it was the perfect opportunity for someone to do something. Nick took out a pair of binoculars Wintour had given him and looked at the white thing on top of Dark Dream. Someone wearing a white cloak, Nick thought. The person on top of Dark Dream wore a white cloak that made them difficult to see under the constant light of the sun. Then Nick saw the person fidgeting with something, but he couldn't see exactly what due to the huge cloak. Well, whatever it is, it can't be good. Nick took a deep breath. He didn't look forward to it.